Okay, it would appear that we're live. So welcome everyone who's watching to another episode of State of Disunion, the show that was meant to be weekly and which has turned out to be once every couple of months. But I'm really excited to have my particular guest today. His name is Ælþemplær. Did I get that
Yes.
right that time? Ælþemplær, there we are. Otherwise known as Rothbard Gillfeather.
Or that's just like that's a pen name I made up.
Just a pen name, or Robert Gorman,
Yeah,
which
that's the
maybe another
the
pen name.
the academic
Um,
name.
I'm getting this from one of your Substack posts, which were really enjoyable. He hails from a mix of Ukrainian Jew and Irish Catholic ancestry, which is just like, if you were asked to give like the two most kind of
Hated.
incongruous, yeah. He's not, he tells us, an old boomer in Texas, but nor, thank God, is he some secret Mossad agent, because I was worried about that, I have to admit. He may say stupid things and he may offend many people, which I just such a great introduction. So would you care to elaborate on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, like I've said many times, I don't really consider myself right wing because I have serious problems with where the right wing is right now. Nor do I consider myself particularly left wing, but I grew up in New York, so I like unions. I like some work or labor related things. So that puts me on like a kind of center left area. But I've typically gotten I can't stand progressives. I think they're just some of the stupidest people I've met in my life, and I've never met an intelligent progressive. Uh, you could probably identify me with morally like old school Democrat, labor worried Catholic group of America that's like, well, the first notion of a nation is to defend its people, and the second notion is to provide benefits to its people. If your nation isn't doing that, you're just not a nation. This push for there's a term that's been going around, a conceptual nation, or the term that I'm thinking about?
Is this something the left says?
Yeah, like progressives say a lot, like, oh, we're a nation of ideas. I'm like, by definition, if I disagree with your ideas, I would be a different nation then. So it's like it's like a dumb thing. Nations exist to protect the tribes that make them up, and if they're not defending them, they're not really a real nation.
So that sounds
Yeah.
like something. Yeah, I don't think I've heard that before. I get one of the things I get a lot from progressives is this. I can't remember the book they always refer to because it tends to be like one source in a lot of these cases, but it's like the imaginations are just intellectual constructions. Basically, they're not like they don't matter because they are so historically porous and the borders change. Like, so they're basically like legal constructions and therefore don't matter.
Yeah. I've never seriously. I when I was younger, I was a bit more right wing, but I have over the years realized that well, if the Constitution can't protect itself, it's kind of useless. Um, I'm much more interested now in terms of I guess academic agent calls it like networks of elites. Like who are your friends and how do you protect your power? And if the way in which you're doing that is admirable and moral, then I'm probably your friend. And if the way in which you're doing that is sneaky and deceptive, then I'm probably just going to find you disgusting.
So you definitely cleave to the friend enemy distinction.
Yeah, it's just like at a fundamental basis, if I can't trust you, then you're not a friend, right? It's that
Yeah, I
simple.
guess, yeah.
And
Yeah.
progressives are not trustworthy people because they start by lying about language. Then they expand by lying about, if not your religion, then someone else's religion, and it's just all built on how can I deceive someone. So it's clearly satanic and evil.
Yeah, on that, actually, I've often thought there's a whole essay that could be written about why Oscar Wilde was a secret conservative, because he had I can't remember the exact words, but he had this lovely saying that, actually, like, the most shallow thing in the world is not to be superficial. And I feel like conservatives on one level are superficial, but in a good way, because what they do is they take the givens of life, like the institutions, the language, like just everything that sort of animates them in their day-to-day life. They take that for granted as having reality. And one thing progressives don't seem to be able to do is to look at anything and just take it for what it is. It has to be deconstructed.
Yeah,
So you're
yeah.
constantly going below the surface.
Yeah, part of my youth, I was raised Catholic, and for a while I wandered around different religions, questioning things. One thing I really liked about, like, for example, Buddhism is the idea of a tabula rasa, that there is a limit to deconstruction where you get to like the bedrock of what a thing is. And if you try to deconstruct that, you're not actually deconstructing it, you're destroying it. Progressives don't seem to understand the concept that there is a limit to deconstruction. Like, okay, you've deconstructed all the ideas, and this is the like the pure thing. Maybe you could say the platonic form of a thing. And that congratulations, you've deconstructed it to the end. Now, what are you going to build with it? And progressives seem to have this idea that they have to like continually deconstruct it until it's non-existent. And like, well, then you're not really left with anything. You're just a force of destruction, right? You're not actually evaluating or reforming. You're just destroying.
Yeah, I feel like the most damaging area in which that occurs is the personal and moral one, not even the sort of societal, institutional one. Obviously, the two are connected, but just the way in which everyday moral concepts are debased to the point where you don't even feel that you can have healthy relations with the people around you.
And they don't have healthy relationships. They constantly question their parental structures, their friendship structures, everything. And they're essentially like breaking up into little minute molecules of a being that isn't even a being, because they've deconstructed the being to just a force of nature, basically. To me, progressives, like, the word really doesn't work anymore. Like, they're not progressing towards anything. They're kind of just dying. A progressive nowadays is someone who doesn't breed, doesn't think, doesn't do anything. They just destroy. So they're kind of useless. I almost view them as something like maybe the iconoclasts of old, where like they don't actually build anything. They're just this like fire that burns through a rich forest of culture, and then you have to rebuild after that fire. Otherwise, it's just going to be a desert.
Yeah, and if and when they are defeated, so to speak, um, I mean, you mentioned iconoclasm. I mean, the Puritans were literally iconoclasts in England, at
Yeah.
least. Um, and then, when Charles II is restored to the throne, or rather the crown, the monarchy is restored with Charles II, people are dancing in the streets. They're happy that Christmas has returned, and everyone's really everyone's relieved.
Yeah, and one of the things that people seem to do is that they tend to bow and apologize and try to get out of the way of this fire of culture, of this like burning down fire. But what I found is that if you just like look at it in the eyes and just don't even respond to it, it kind of can't touch you, and it just eventually ignores you. You kind of have to, if you view progressives as a fire, then the only solution is to be a stone, and they can't do anything. Fire can't burn stone. It can just go around it. It can purify the area around it, but eventually it burns out and it's gone. I think recently, in America, there was this guy, Richard Hanania, who's not really a great force for right wing politics, but he got canceled by a journalist or something, and essentially he just ignored it and then just laughed it off, and nothing happened to him. People who bow to progressives tend to get destroyed by progressives, because you can't bow to a fire; you're just going to get burned. So it's usually best to like deconstruct the deconstructors and get to their base. Like, what is the base thing that they are? And once you view progressives as nothing more than a cultural fire, you know how to respond to it. Just be a stone and wait for it to go away.
Yeah, I did a video that touched upon this, called, what was it called? The Diabolic West and the Culture War, in which I basically made the theological argument that, from a Christian perspective, anger is, a serious sort of disturbance of the soul and to be avoided, and it's for that reason that, whereas before, and I wanna ask you why you said you feel sort of slightly less right wing now than before, because I think this ties into all that, but certainly it applies to myself as well. Like, I went through the sort of typical period where I was watching, Douglas Murray videos and being like, "Yeah, stick it to the progressives," and all the rest of it. But I sort of began to realize, particularly as I became more religious, that as you say, it's just you're feeding the fire, and you're damaging your own soul and sanity in the process. But I'm sort of wondering what would being a stone look like in practice? Because I don't
Well,
know.
if you prepare for the fire, you have close friends that won't abandon you. You have, um, a secure job that won't fire you, and you have connections that will benefit you. You form a network that can endure that fire. Like, if you're just a pebble, then you probably might get broken in half. But as far as I can tell, like, people have tried to cancel me, I guess, in real life and in person for different reasons, and I essentially just looked at them as like I just don't care. And if you just cut off communication with them and let them like pout, they look like the child. They look like the insane person they are. Progressives get angrier, like because they're feeding into their vices. They get more vicious when you ignore them. If you answer them, they feel like they have power or some like hook on you to pull. But if you just deny them, they just tend to like get feisty and angry, and people around them start like distancing themselves from that person because now they're the asshole.
Yeah. Is it a shame, how much this has affected daily life as well? I feel like when all this trend got started, I mean, obviously the roots go back much further, but, when this culture war stuff really, got into the public consciousness, um, it was sort of limited to, like, a few individuals on social media and in the mainstream media, but it really has and it's so generational as well, like, most of the people I know, it's kind of sad that you can make this generalization to begin with, but most of the people I know who are my age or younger, it is so predictable what they will think about any given topic,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's become real in the sense it's like the draft in America, it kind of ruined, well, the Civil War, to go back further, like, it pulled families apart.
I've often noticed, especially with like whatever is hot in the news, that they'll usually latch onto. If you just wait a few months and then wait for the fire to cool down, you can usually nab a few of them to your side, because like now people are starting to question BLM now that they realize that it didn't actually do anything and it just kind of like burned down things and nothing else. You have like liberals starting to like question why they supported BLM. Like, well, you probably should have thought of that. If you would have engaged them when they were on their like fiery, like burning desire to destroy things, you would have been consumed. But if you just wait until they calm down, until the fire loses its potency, then you can usually convince them that they were kind of stupid and they should really rethink what they're doing. And
Mhm.
the same people that are like were fans of BLM 3 years ago are now fans of like whatever is now, be it the Ukraine Russia war or the abortion debate's kind of closing off actually. But like right now, what's in the news a lot and a lot of burning fire around it is probably related to immigration and um maybe immigration's a hot topic now, but it kind of feels like the progressives are losing steam because they've kind of burned through all of their topics. Nothing changed, nothing happened, and only people lives only got worse. So they're kind of out of steam now, and now's a good time to start not debating them but being like, told you so. Like, don't debate progressives, just take the when the L presents itself to give to them, hand them an L and be like, told you so, and then walk away. And most of them will just lash about and be bitter, but a few of them might start questioning why they were on that side at all.
Yeah, I think for most people that would be the case. I mean, that dynamic where, as you say, it almost comes back to bite them. The problem, Black Lives Matter turns out to be a racket, and they're like, oh, maybe I should have thought about it. I do think a lot of that will take place with immigration because actually, like, some of the most progressive people in society probably don't want some of the least progressive people in the world living on their doorstep.
Yeah, yeah.
But you have to wonder because I read this. You might even have heard of this story as well. I'm assuming there's more than one kind of this story as well. I think it was in Germany or something. This poor woman, German woman, she basically, I think she was actually working for some kind of NGO that was pro-refugee, and she got raped by like a Syrian or an Iraqi, you know, air quotes refugee, and it didn't change her opinion at all. She kind of doubled down, and those are the cases that really kind of,
Yeah.
it's amazing to me, but
There's always going to be those people that are diehards, but the
yeah.
thing is, there's a term I'm going to bring up later on if we get into more religious stuff. I'm not well versed on theology, but I call this the thing points to itself. And like, you kind of don't need to argue the point. You don't need to debate the point. You just point to that thing and say, like, look at what that has done to that person. It's made them a complete they clearly don't respect themselves if they're allowing themselves to be violated like that, right? So just point to that and be like, that is the thing I don't want to be. And you can skip the debate and be like, I don't want to be that woman.
Yeah.
I don't want to be this person that accepts the abuse of their body and soul and torture. Like that's not what I want for me. If I end up getting married one day, I don't want my daughters to be like that. I want them to take like I don't want to say pride, but like, you are a sacred being. Don't let someone violate you like that.
Mm. Well, let's talk about religion a bit more because I'm super fascinated in all subjects. Religion, I think religion is the great topic of conversation. And just to as a segue into that, you mentioned earlier that you had problems with the right, um, or a certain segment of the right, and B, are less right wing now than you once were. And I was wondering why you're less right wing than you are now. For me, it was partly due to religion, which I think a lot of progressives would sort of they'd often when people become more religious, they become more conservative, don't they? So for me, it's been slightly the opposite. I would say that I'm theologically very conservative and orthodox, but politically, I'm much, especially you're a Catholic. I'm on the road to becoming a Catholic in communion with the church. There's that whole Catholic tradition of social teaching, which has always been uncomfortable with capitalism and communism and socialism. I mean, you describe yourself as a distributist in your Twitter
Yeah.
bio. So is that part of the reason?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you realize is when you move into faith is that you realize the material world, while it's a created thing and it will be resurrected, it's still dying, and you can't put your worth in that. Like it's you can't have a world that's purely based off of line go up, because what is the cheapest thing to do in capitalism? It's to import massive amounts of poor people that don't know how to defend themselves, so you can strip them of all their worth and work them to death. Right? Like the ultimate end of capitalism is bare minimum payment to your workers and bare maximum profits. That is the goal of capitalism.
Mm,
The goal of the church is to build up people. So like you get wealthy, but you make sure that some part of your wealth is improving your community, your family, your tribe, and your people, so that they can like help each other. Like the progressive mind will think you see this a lot with like a lot of the mission trips. Mission trips are always to some faraway land where you don't have any social connection with the person, and it's kind of treated like almost like a vacation. And that's a very capitalist view of mission trips, where like I'm there for 2 weeks to do some acts of service and disappear from this person's life. The Christian view of a mission trips is you live amongst the people, you share in their experiences, and you get to know them, and you kind of like build them up, to protect themselves, to know the faith and the word of God, and then to share that with their neighbors. You're not there just as a vacation, you're there as a labor and a work of love. And so this kind of breaks away from the capitalist view of like just pure capital extraction to, well, I don't want to just extract, I want to build something there. Like when I think about if I was an older, wealthier person, I would want to go to a place and build, not just build a well and what disappear, but teach them how to build a well, how a well works, and show how they can benefit their neighbors, or like teach them how to farm and how a farm works. And you get a surprising thing where once it's a Christian perspective, capitalism is healthier because it's now based off of how can you get a people to be aware of the worth of material goods and not just extract it, but actually promote its viability. So you don't just like destroy a forest and plant the most profitable crops. You limit a forest to exist and preserve it, and then you have crops that benefit the people's diet and livelihoods. And it may not be the most profitable crop, but it is the most beneficial crop for that people. And you can see that kind of if you look at a global agricultural map. Uh, most of the agriculture of the world comes from the United States because it was built on that somewhat Christian view a little bit. Whereas like Africa was built purely off of like a colonial extraction, and now there's no farms left because the colonists left and they never departed. They never imparted their skills to the people. So the people
mhm,
just are like left starving and have no idea how to farm. And then they start attacking their neighbors because they're hungry. So like you leave a place worse than it was. There were mission trips to Africa, of course, and where that benefit the people most, you have the most stable countries. I'm thinking something like maybe Kenya, which is like, it was a colony, it was colonial extraction, but because the people were brought into the faith, and the local nobility imparted that knowledge from the colonizer to the people, that Kenya is in a better position than, say, South Africa.
Mm.
And I think you end up seeing a much more blessed situation if you take the Catholic and distributist approach than the pure capital extraction approach. The core of distributism is that you have this idea that everybody should have easily accessible means of production for themselves and their neighbor. It's not like the communist that takes everything for the for the state and then owns it, nor is it like the capitalist where it's purely like a small majority ownership of the means of production, and no one else can really do anything more than work in a factory and then go home and die from cancer. It's this idea that, well, how do I distribute the means of production to the people so that they can make their own capital assets and bless their neighbors? And I think that approach is a balance that has proven to make more stable communities.
Yeah, it's only ever really worked on the small scale so far, I feel. There's,
Yeah.
oh, you might know that, I forget the name. It's something, E.F. Schumacher. He wrote a really good book called The Beauty of Small or something like that, in which he basically argues for distributism and Catholicism without ever really mentioning either. It's a tiny little masterpiece. Um, but it must be quite depressing to be a distributist right now, right? Because I feel like, in the way that you've described it very succinctly, the giving to ordinary people of the means of their own production, as Chesterton put it, every man a cow and a home, or whatever it was. I mean, the entire developed world seems to be mitigating against that, like, quite
Yeah,
consciously almost.
and it started with small things, and now it's kind of gone to like, well, now you have like huge monopolies running America's agriculture and driving into the ground, where like last time I looked, we have something like 30 to 40 years of fertile soil left because we're over farming it and not caring about the future. It's just pure wealth extraction. So, America might dominate the farming world now, but it won't in a century if it keeps going this way. Um, and that careless wealth extraction seems to, it is right wing to like maximize your personal wealth at the expense of everyone else. But the end result is your descendants are going to be poorer when they can't inherit your wealth extracting mechanisms because the materials ran out, and the people around you are going to be even poorer, and they're going to hate you and probably kill your kids. So it's like, why would you go down this path of one generation wealth extraction that destroys both your neighbors and your offspring? It just seems suicidal to me.
Yeah, I've two thoughts on that. The first is that, this reminds me of Thomas Paine and his great debate with Burke in the sort of the inception of the United States. Because in that pamphlet war they had, Paine says explicitly in so many words, like he literally says future generations don't matter.
I
He
don't think he
quite
had kids, right? The Paine never have kids, right?
No, he didn't, and actually that is a good point, because a lot of the people who say this kind of stuff don't. I mean, I don't, full disclosure, but I'd like kids one day, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, so that isn't a civilization. That's a one-off, like, nothing, basically. If you go in the Bible, in the sons of Noah, Nimrod is kind of like that. He's called a great hunter, but the word in which they use in Hebrew for hunter, which I forget, but it kind of doesn't mean hunting animals, it means hunting men. And
Oh,
so
great.
he was just like the first global homo, mass migration city builder
Mm.
that extracted as much wealth and power as he could. And the thing is, he never has any genealogies associated to him. It doesn't seem like he had any kids. He just extracted all the wealth he could, turned the land into a desert and a farce, and then his empire never lasted. His cities outlasted him, but his empire never
It
lasted. And then his cities were given to other people. So it's,
Wait,
it's kind of like
sorry,
a
who's this again? With
Nimrod, I think
Nimrod.
grandson of Noah.
Okay.
So like he builds a lot of cities. He becomes like I guess a hunter of men. So like he brings in all the immigrants of all the other sons of Noah, and he builds these great cities and extracts great power and wealth. And then he dies, and it doesn't seem like his power or wealth or anything goes to anyone else. So he's just forgotten about.
Yeah, this is the Pangaea theory that you've written about on
Yeah,
Substack?
a little bit, a little bit. That's not really
Yeah,
related directly, but I wrote a little bit about Nimrod in there, I think. And Nimrod is kind of like a case study of what global homo, if you will. I'm using that term loosely. What does that produce in the end? It produces ruins and destroyed land and
and
genetic
sterility.
debt and sterility. It's not really something that's worth investing in. But the current world hegemony seems to be a diehard dedicated like focus on that. And maybe it's because they think they'll live forever. Maybe they really think technology is going to extend their lives or something. But most of these people are in their 70s and 80s, and they're just not going to make it.
There are certainly people who, Silicon Valley largely, there are certainly people who do genuinely believe that they will live forever. You can see it in their eyes,
I
like,
could, yeah, yeah.
you know how that's that meme, where, progressives, particularly progressive women, I hate to say, they've got that look, like, it's in the eyes, that's the meme, like, you can just sort of tell. I feel like, Thomas Sowell has that phrase, "The vision of the anointed," and I feel like these people who wanna live forever, they've got something similar in their eyes. It's like the past, 20,000 years of human history and all of the lessons, in hubris, that offers just never occurs to them.
Yeah, and a lot of them are childless, and a lot of them are building sandcastles that will be destroyed by the sea. I've called this in my private life sandcastle syndrome. Uh, I've seen a lot in New York, especially with older boomers who spend their lives building these little petty kingdoms, and sometimes it's just like a corner grocery store, and sometimes it's like a monopoly of an industry. But like the kids are either like really stupid and clearly won't manage that as well, or they just don't have kids,
Mm,
and it boggles the mind of what they think this will do in the long run. They'll be forgotten about, their capital will be taken by others, and it'll just be gone. There's nothing of a legacy left. And sometimes it may be that they're just so focused on that that they don't want to think about anything else. They'll say, well, I'm good at this and that's what I'm going to do. And a lot of times underneath the cover, it's like a bit of a hopeless soul case where they kind of gave up on any long-term thinking because this is the one thing they're good at. This is the one way they can support themselves, and they kind of get lost in that tidal drift towards pure capital extraction.
mm. So I do wanna get on to the Pangaea theory if you want to, but I
Yeah.
first want to ask just a more basic question, which is, and this might seem a bit strange because it's obviously all sorted out in your head, presumably, but why Catholic?
Yeah, I mean, I was raised Catholic, so I have a bias towards it, but um, I tried different religions and different denominations throughout the last decade, basically, and nothing really seemed to be sustainable as a belief system. Yeah, I was evangelical for a few years, and it just seemed to be a lot of like, what's this year's buzzword from the pastoral conference, right?
Mm,
Like this year's buzz, like um, there I can't think of any because I've forgotten them all. But there's always like a buzzword that the pastors think of, and that's going to be the buzzword for the year, and they're going to all focus their sermons on that one buzzword, and then next year's a different buzzword, next year's a different buzzword, and it doesn't actually stick. You just end up getting these lambs that are eating like spiritual fast food, and they don't remember what they ate, right?
mm.
And or sometimes in the more eccentric areas it becomes like a kind of spiritual dessert they get fat off of and then just die. um are you familiar with the term burnover district?
No, I'm not.
It's a term from New York because in the 1800s there were a lot of these like brand new denominations popping up, and they would all go and like have these like big reformations and restorations and get like 10,000 people to come to a church and celebrate the Holy Spirit returning, and then they would just give up on that particular corner and move on to the next district. And so most of New York is atheist today because after 5 or 6 times of this happening in people's life, they just viewed it all as a racket. They didn't view it as anything spiritually benefiting them, and they just gave up. And as a result, like the generations henceforth in upstate New York have been like 1 to 5% Christian. They're just all atheists, and it's called the burned over district because or the burned over districts because they've been burned over by the spiritual fire. There's nothing left. It's just that they're a destroyed culture. Mormonism started here, for example, and then they went west, and then there were like shakers and bakers and different. You might be familiar with the term shaker. I don't know if you are.
Yes.
Yes, like Shakers started around here, and like all these different denominations started in upstate New York off those spiritual highs, but they never built anywhere, so they just kind of burned over. So that kind of put me off to a lot of America's denominations, where like I can see the consequences of this religion across generations. The thing points to itself. The end result is a carcass. I tried Lutheranism for a while, and I still really appreciate Luther as a historic figure and a writer, but even Luther was making exceptions for divorce and other immoralities in his life. And he never really explained why he was doing that. And then within a generation, they were basically like proto-Calvinists. So they had completely departed from a lot of the traditions of the faith in favor of whatever they could reason themselves into. And this idea of reasoning and arguing and debating everything, it kind of evolved into a kind of progressive deconstructism game. Eventually the Eucharist was no longer anything but a symbol. Everything's symbols, like churches are symbols, and that symbols everywhere. Nothing's real. And you end up getting these like, the oldest Lutheran churches are also the most progressive, and the few leftover people that care about the faith and try to preserve whatever Luther wanted, they're kind of on the back burn. Like the LCMS here is one of the more conservative Lutheran churches. Their average age of the parishioner just hit 60. So it's like the children clearly aren't buying this stuff. And so that kind of put me off of Lutheranism. And then just seeing how the boomers in that church are just self-destructive, hateful people. It's just like, I really don't care about these people anymore. I explored different forms of Methodism. I really like Martin Lloyd-Jones. His writing is really, his sermons are great. But again, like, what's Methodism today? It kind of took it too far and became nothing. It seemed like every Protestant denomination I looked at has this like very fiery, passionate generation, and it never lasts. It clearly lost something during the Reformation that it couldn't sustain itself on, or at least not for a few generations. And when it's fine and great to have a Reformation when you're literally ruling a continent on your religious dogma, but once that's questioned and debated, it doesn't seem to be able to outlast the conversation. It can't seem to justify itself, and people just leave. So that kind of put me off of almost all of Protestantism as just like this. It seems to be like a one-off religious flame that can't really sustain itself without the heritage of the faith.
Yeah. If I could really quickly jump in
Yep.
there, it reminds me of, are you familiar with Gavin Ashenden?
No.
He used to be the chaplain to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. So he was an Anglican, and he converted to Catholicism, I think a couple of years ago now. And he basically said, I feel as though the whole project of Protestantism, in which he includes, the Church of England for whatever Catholic credentials it aspires to, it's basically an experiment that has run its course. Well, he was actually referring specifically to the Church of England, but it's an experiment that's completely run its course, and as you say, has just lost that fire. But I do find it interesting that you say that's the reason, with the burned over districts, that so many people are atheist in New York, because in London, almost exclusively because of mass immigration to London, London is actually one of the most religious places in Europe.
Yeah.
Which I just, it's kind of ironic, really. Like, yeah, but maybe London is different from New York in that respect. I don't know. I
Well,
feel
it's
like America does pluralism better than we do.
yeah. I don't know if they're all entirely Christian, are they? Or is it just like religious? Like,
Oh, well, I mean, that's certainly there are lots and lots of Christians in London,
yeah.
but yeah, a lot of Muslims as well. Like, I used to live in a place called Bethnal Green, and if you Google image Whitechapel, what's it called?
Oh, I've been
Whitechapel.
there. Yeah, I visited
Yeah,
there. It's
so
very
I
Islamic.
mean, it is like, and I don't, I'm not gonna say this in any way in a pejorative sense, but you do kind of feel like you're on a street in Karachi or something. It's quite remarkable.
I would say that because London was an imperial capital, it tends like imperial capitals tend to be that. They tend to be the meeting place where even after an empire falls, an imperial capital will often outlast its empire,
Mm,
both as like a place of mixing and a place of like, keeping a fire alight. I'll get more into that later. But like in New York, it's like, New York was a bit of a financial capital, so they were always worshiping money first. But even upstate where it's very rural, it's very secular. But yeah, so for most of the Protestantism, that made me rethink a lot. And to be honest, I don't think I ever really was Protestantism. I never joined a Protestant church. I was always a tourist. And the reason why I initially stopped going to Catholic church is really lame. It was just because all my roommates were going to this non-denominational church, and it seemed to
Oh,
be like,
okay. I was about to ask
yeah.
why you stopped attending mass,
No,
but
it
yeah.
was just it was just convenience. All my Catholic friends graduated, and I just want friends to go to church with.
Okay. Well, that's not
So,
necessarily a bad thing.
so I don't know. I just kind of I kept the teaching of the Catholic Church in me, but I didn't go to Catholic church for like maybe like 7 years or so. And especially during the pandemic, seeing how much Protestantism really didn't question anything about what was going on between BLM and the pandemic, and even the wars going on now. They just seem to be interested in pleasing people and not actually benefiting their souls. And that really depressed me, and it gave me a sour taste of Protestantism as an experiment in general. I think the last couple of years have, to me at least, they've kind of proven Protestantism doesn't have the capacity to question its the authority over it. The role of the church is really to keep the lords of the land in check from excesses of vice. In terms of civil society, that's the role of the church, and they don't seem to have done that at all during the pandemic. There were a few exceptions, but like they were usually limited to areas where there was a generational effort to keep that church alive. So there's a few like decent Baptists and Presbyterians around here and there that have attempted, like I think the most sustainable Protestantism today is probably Presbyterianism, just because they seem to be the only church that has a focus on creating generational connections rather than just purely like high fire, like smoking fire showcases. So for a while I went to Redeemer in New York. That's Tim Keller's church, and that was I still have good thoughts about that church, and I still think that's like in the long run that's probably gonna be one of the only Protestant denominations that survives, because everyone else just isn't. Um, but even they were kind of going along with the culture and not really questioning a lot of things that were happening. Um, and anyway, that's just my turning point from, well, Protestantism is kind of dying, so I'm not going to die with them. Uh, I my mom's side comes from an Eastern Orthodox, Eastern Catholic approach, so there's a little bit of orthodoxy in there in my in what I know and familiar with, and I do have a great appreciation for the Orthodox Church, but I kind
Yeah,
of,
I was gonna ask
yeah.
you if you had ever considered joining them.
I don't agree with their view. Well, they kind of don't believe in original sin. At least not not in the Western sense of the word. Uh, and so I kind of disagree with that, because maybe I am just really cynical, but I do think people are born with an innate evil in them that has to be curtailed and contained as early as possible. I do have a lot of hope that the Orthodoxy and the Catholics will reunite one day, but
Oh god,
really
I hope
getting
so.
yeah, really getting to the heart and soul of that divide between human nature and how we commune with God is going to require a lot of scholarly debate. Um, Orthodoxy has its own crisis right now with the Russian-Ukraine war, and it's kind of sad to see them dividing over petty political conflict rather than trying to play the role the church should play in terms of brokering peace and curtailing the lords. Um, but I have some very big question, like no nos with what Orthodoxy believes about human nature, and I'm not totally informed in how they view the Trinity, but something about it kind of confuses me a little bit. I do tend to lean more on, like, there seems to be an order of divinity within the Trinity, where Catholics don't necessarily agree with that. So I guess my conception of the Trinity seems to be a little bit more Eastern Catholic rather than Western Catholic / like a little bit more Orthodox. But my conception of like the human being is very Catholic. I very much so agree with the Catholic understanding of what we are as human beings. Um, I have a very deep appreciation of the Ethiopian church also, because
Mm,
they're this little corner, often the corner of the world far forgotten, and they kind of preserved a large amount of older teachings. For example, like I really appreciate the Book of Enoch. I think it's a great book. I don't think it's canonical necessarily, but the Ethiopians do consider it canonical, and it has a lot of really interesting perspectives of how the human soul is berated and broken. It has a whole section of like basically how demons twist the soul. It goes through like what sins are connected to other ones, how they feed into each other. It kind of has this like very advanced scholarship within it in terms of how to preserve your soul in trying times. And I've always appreciated the Ethiopian church because they clearly have demonstrated through their history that they can do that. They've survived Marxism, tribalism, Islam, all kinds of wars and chaos, and they've pretty much landed on their feet throughout all of that. The Ethiopian church has remained steadfast in that way, and I have hope that there's some hope for reunification there. The reason why they're divided from the Catholic Church is kind of lame. Is just like a disagreement that they had with some conceptions of the Trinity that they both admitted they no longer have those disagreements. So there's really no reason why they should be divided. Same with the I think either the Coptic or the Eastern Oriental Church, I forget. But yeah, a lot of these small older churches in the East and then the South, I have an interest in terms of like why they broke off or why they were forgotten about, but they don't really speak to me in terms of like the call of Christ, which I think the Catholic Church has fulfilled the most in history. Like it's really the Catholic Church that converted entire continents. No other church has really done that. And ultimately, that is the mission of the church, to convert the world. And it seems like the Catholic Church is the only one that hasn't lost sight of that. Yeah,
yeah, it's got this very unique, I don't know whether to say charisma or charism, or both, but, I mean, certainly I mean, I was not raised Roman Catholic in the slightest. I wasn't even raised Christian, to be honest with you, but there was always I remember being at a dinner party, years ago now. I think I'd graduated already, so I was sort of in that, just after, like, I didn't know what to do with my life.
yeah,
And I was on the road to becoming a Christian. Um, and I was at a dinner party, and there was a few Catholics present, a whole bunch of atheists, one Eastern Orthodox, and an Anglo-Catholic. And someone said to me, like, "Why are you so fascinated by Roman Catholicism?" And I said, "Well, it just seems to be like the real deal, like the real thing." And the look on the Anglo-Catholic's face, I mean, I think he wanted to punch me. Um, but it does have this allure for so many people, which often they can't articulate. But I would agree with you. Yeah.
yeah. I think what ultimately brought me back was, or going back to church regularly in the Catholic Church was, uh, I just really felt connected to a lot of the historic preservation of the faith. I have my questions about things like purgatory and indulgences, but ultimately I decided it's better to submit to what has endured than to break away from what has endured. Um, and I think that the value of submission is something that Westerners don't like to hear about.
No, not
Um,
at all.
and as you turn 30, you realize you're not God on earth anymore, and you're getting older, and you're like, well, I need to submit to something that guides me through the chaos that I'm living through, and the Catholic Church has provided that. Um, to be honest, one of the first nudges pulling me back to the Catholic Church was when I visited London. I think
Oh, okay.
I visited some kind of church, St. Mary's, maybe I forget what church it was, but there was this very young priest who heard my confession, and he was a very uh, hopeful that I would continue going to church, and he seemed to be very passionate about the faith. And I went to a pub afterwards and just talked to random Londoners, because you don't get that in New York. In London, you can just talk to anybody in a pub, and it's just so friendly. I love that about London. In New York, they look at you like you're crazy.
That's
Uh,
amazing because I literally can't believe you just said that because I may okay, maybe it's the fact you're American, maybe you're just Like, I don't wanna tread on your toes or insult you or anything, but I
No,
I
I know,
wanna
I know.
I feel like Americans are much more comfortable anyway, like, being just sort of open in that way. Like, I go to a local in my small rural town called, the Carpenter's Arms, and the last time I was in there, there was barely anyone in there. It was just me and, like, 2 or 3 others, and these people walked in, and it was clearly like an Ame it was clearly this young American guy being, like, shepherded around by his 2, like, English hosts, and, he came in and he was so quiet, and immediately he came in and was like, "Oh my god, this is so charming. It's like being in the Shire, you know, how are you?" And he was shaking the and I just thought that's so nice, and I can't believe you said what you just said because I lived in London for 8 years, and I can't imagine going into a pub and just striking up a conversation with another Londoner. But because I would always assumed that New York was more, disposed to that, but,
I'm
it
I'm sure I'm sure it is in some areas. I'm not exactly I don't go to a lot of bars in New York City because they're loud, and I don't like loud. Um,
yeah, me
it
neither.
just it just seemed very friendly. But anyway, yeah, I didn't appreciate the seriousness that they took their faith, and I didn't really feel like that was probably back in 2017. That was before the pandemic. And so 2018, 2019, I'm going to the Presbyterian churches in New York, and I'm kind of like, well, I just don't feel like I'm getting what I got in that little experience in London.
So what
Um,
did they say in the pub? Like, what was that like?
It's just I was just talking about the old boomers and, like, how the city's changed and what they think the future holds. I think it was, like, right after Brexit, and so that was the topic a lot of times, and what people had their hopes for Brexit and their fears, and, like, I guess fears won out a lot more nowadays, but,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, it was still those last gleamings of a hopeful rebirth of Britain before everyone became very bitter towards the Tories.
Yeah,
I
rightfully
don't
so.
know. So, yeah, I decided to really start taking the Catholic faith more seriously probably this year when a lot of my Lutheran friends seem to be facing a lot of pastoral bitterness. And I hadn't gone to a Lutheran church in like 7 years or something, but I remember there's always that kind of like feeling of like a fake peaceful, like a fake welcomeness. And the second you actually question anything, they kind of turn a bit bitter. One of the big things that turned me off to Protestantism was when Roe v. Wade got overturned. I saw a lot of Lutheran pastors lamenting it. And I was just like, wow, you guys are more lost than I thought. Um, and, it made me very depressed to see. Um, there are legitimate fears with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, I'll say, but a lot of them were exaggerated and not taking the side of They weren't acting like pastors; they were acting like worldly men. Um, and
Mhm.
I didn't really like that. And I think overturning Roe v. Wade really was the cutoff point when I really was like, I can't call myself any kind of Protestant ever again. Um, Again, like I would if you read my Substack, I've always like I have a lot of articles from that time, and you can see me debating if I'm still Catholic or not. And ultimately, I decided, yeah, I am definitely still Catholic because all my teachings and beliefs remain Catholic, despite going to Lutheran churches and Presbyterian churches and Methodist churches. And I was like, well, I kind of not lost any of my Catholic teachings. I still take the Eucharist seriously. I still think the saints pray for us. I still think um, that there is works that need to be done to maintain the health of the gift of salvation. Like you can't just like there's something like a lot of times when the Bible speaks about being saved, it's kind of like in a I forget the grammar term, but it's meant to be read as a continual process, not a fixed point. Like there's no time when you're actually saved unless you die and go to heaven. Throughout your life, you're being saved. It takes work. It takes the effort of your neighbors and your baptismal sponsors, if you will. I also like I kind of don't like the fact that the term baptismal sponsor has been forgotten in the West a lot where like if you choose to be someone's baptismal sponsor, you're kind of choosing to be a secular confessor almost. You're choosing to be in their life to help them work through things. I don't even know who
Right.
my baptismal sponsor was. Maybe it was my parents, but um,
Okay,
you
so
know,
that's like
yeah,
that's the religious term for because I've just heard sponsor.
yeah. A baptismal sponsor is someone who agrees to oversee the child's faith as they grow up, kind of like in
Okay.
between baptism and confirmation. I just figured, I was baptized and confirmed in the Catholic faith when I was young. I went through Catholic education. I always had a connection to that, and that connection's never seemed to have died exploring Protestantism. So
Mm,
I should probably stop lying to myself. Uh, at different low points, there were other reasons why I was looking at Protestant churches. Younger people, the potential to make friends, and maybe even find a wife. But those things never really manifested at all, and I kind of felt like the friendships were lax, and or not lax. Like the friendships were never that deep, and the hope of finding a wife was kind of a farce because they're all very like um self-imposed loneliness a lot of times amongst the Protestants. They're very lonely people, I think.
mm.
Um, and I just don't want that.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I've written about loneliness and have written about it as well for Bournebrook magazine, which is coming out soon. It's a huge problem. I often feel like Catholic men, or at least Catholic men who take the faith seriously, and I can't really claim to be a Catholic man yet. Hopefully, in a month or so, I'm being confirmed in Brompton Oratory.
Nice.
Um, but I often feel like for Catholic men who take the faith seriously, that there's really only three three options for them, which is become a husband and father, um, live a as the church sort of commands, I guess, live a chaste, single, celibate lay life, or become a monk basically, or a priest or something. Those are your three options.
I've always had the temptation to submit myself to the Eastern Catholic part of Catholicism because you're allowed to get married and then become a priest. You know that?
Okay.
So, but I'm not really like I like the tradition I come from, but I don't know enough about it. I just know that in Eastern Catholics, that the Pope has allowed a what they call a a pastoral concession. That's what they call it, because the Eastern Catholics always allowed their priests to marry because they're close to the Orthodox Church, and so when they came back into the Catholic fold, they requested the Pope to allow this concession where their priests could get married. And so essentially, if you're married first, you can become a priest. If you become a priest, you're not allowed to get married. Um,
Mm,
so it's kind of they call it a pastoral concession, and that's an interesting term because it's kind of saying in better times with a more secure faith, we would imagine our priests to be all unmarried. But because you're coming into the fold and you have a lot of your traditions, we're going to give you this concession, hoping that your children might choose the more traditional Catholic approach of unmarried priests. But
yeah.
I do, yeah.
No, sorry, go on.
I was gonna say is like I do appreciate the gentleness of that rejoining of the East and West in a small sense, where like they call it a concession, where like it's not ideal, but you're submitting to the Pope and the traditions of the Church. So if I was ever to feel the call to become a priest, I would probably first want to get married and do it through the Eastern Catholic Church, because I do have that. I have that lineage. That you're allowed to call yourself an Eastern Catholic if you have that lineage in you, and I do. So I can submit myself to an Eastern Catholic bishop and do that if I wanted to. For now, I'm in New York, and there's not really many Eastern Catholic churches here. But if I wanted to, it's a path I could consider.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, your avatar kind of looks somewhat priestly already.
It's Blade Runner.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah, it's a cartoon version of Rick Deckard, the
Did
first
you
character.
did you draw it?
Nah, I found it on some random DeviantArt account or something. Uh, it's not even AI, so it's just a really good drawing. I like that character a lot.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, oh man, I feel I said before we came on air that I was a Luddite, and I kind of feel like I've betrayed that now because my avatar is just an AI version of my face
yeah,
during my
yeah,
sailing days.
yeah. I have some fans because I used to do AI art posters with the Restoration Bureau thing I made. I don't know if you heard of that one, but
No.
it was like a propaganda thing I did for a while. I'll probably start it up again next year, but it got pretty popular. It had like 8,000 followers on Telegram, and people loved it. But they were like kind of like AI generated propaganda posters, and not entirely AI generated. I did a lot of handwork on it because I do like technology, but I don't want to be dependent on it. Like if I use AI, I usually set up a local server and train it on my own art. I can draw. I'm in like the design field, so I can draw, and so I'll train it on my own art, and then it makes art like me rather than like some generic stuff.
Mm. Yeah,
But
definitely.
yeah, but anyway, to kind of like go back to religion, it's it's kind of like one of the things those things where I'm kind of getting more deep into my Catholic faith now, and I've started going to confession regularly. I've started exploring those things. I'm not like some kind of like someone. New York has a lot of these like Latin mass extremists, and I'm
Oh,
kind of like
the
yeah,
trad cats.
yeah. I've found myself just totally apathetic to that argument. I kind of view the whole Treadcath argument to be silly. I don't mind the Pope. I don't think he's some like closet Marxist or something. You know, he says stupid things like all old people do, but he, you know, if you know how the Catholic Church works, you know he can't actually change anything. He's just kind of like there to maintain the bishop order, and issue decrees at the bishop's demand. One thing's interesting though. I think this year or next they're starting the synod discussions, which would essentially open the door to vernacular practices of Catholicism. Similar to like it's kind of like, well, it's worked so well with the Eastern Catholics. Maybe we should explore it with other cultures. Maybe you can't have this monolithic Roman Catholic culture, but you can have a Catholic Church that includes the Roman liturgy, the Eastern liturgy, and other liturgies too. I kind of like that move in the Catholic Church because I kind of think that there should be like, you know, an Aztec liturgy or an Incan liturgy, like where the people can bring their traditional music and conceptions of what is sacred into the fold of the Catholic faith. Well, one of my favorite examples of this actually is what, you know, when the Spanish conquered the Aztec, one of the ways in which they preached the gospel to the Aztec is because the Aztec had this concept of like eating like, you know, cannibalism. Basically, they had this
Mm.
idea that you eat the warrior you conquered so you can acquire their strength, like you're eating their soul as well as their body. The Catholic missionaries actually turned that into a liturgical point for the Mexicans so that they could understand the Eucharist as like literally eating God's strength. I find that to be quite marvelous and clever, and it's really only something that the Catholic Church can do. Related to that Panchaea thing, so I forget the name of the guy, Euphorism or something. He's like a philosopher from ancient Greece who kind of doubted that the gods were actually gods. He was more of the belief that the gods of the Greek pantheon were ancient humans, ancient kings, maybe angels and demons. And so he wasn't the first to propose it, but he was one of the more famous cases, and he kind of pissed off a large amount of the pagan world with these theories.
Oh, you
Again,
wrote about this in your yeah,
yeah, yeah,
I've got the, I'm trying to look for it because 'cause I've got your article open. Oh,
yeah.
yeah,
It's in the opening. Um, and it's not euphemism. It's like euphorism. I forget his name. He's like a weird Greek name, but this was actually one of the like the ancient approaches to other religions that the Catholic missionaries to Mexico tried to use, where they said, well, your gods may just be ancient kings or warriors or angels and demons, and the Mexican
Euhemerus.
Euhemerus, yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
And that approach was very successful, and it led to the conversion of the entire like Southern American continent, basically. And this appears to be a rather consistent trend amongst Catholic missionaries from the ancient times, basically. Going all the way back to Paul picking up the icon to an unknown god and saying, I've come to bring you your unknown god. Um, there's this idea in the Western tradition where we do tend to ancestor worship a little bit. You know, we tend to try and turn our emperors into gods. We tend to turn our great generals into divinities. It's just a cultural trend in Europe as well as other places in the world. And the Catholic Church kind of realized that they don't have to actually destroy the existing heritage and culture of a people. They can integrate them in by kind of downgrading them to ancient kings within the fold of the Catholic faith. And that makes a lot of sense to me, I think, because it's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
You see a lot of that form, not so much in the content, but a lot of that in terms of form, you see going on literally with Aquinas's absorption of Aristotle's thought, and
Yeah,
also in Aristotle and subsequent Greek playwrights references to. So I think in Greek there's a distinction between I don't know Greek, so I'm going to butcher this, but like there was ho theos, meaning God above God, like the
yeah.
God above gods, and then like all the gods. So even as early as Aristotle, you get this kind of there's a kind of growing recognition, at least in the philosophical schools, that there is this distinction between the gods you worship on a daily basis and this unknown kind of primal being, which we would now call, the Holy Trinity, I suppose.
Yeah, Plato did that too, actually.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, he actually wrote treatises of what he claimed to be like lost religious traditions. My favorite is this quote of his in a treatise. Where is the quote? I wrote in my article. So like you can in my article I mentioned that Jesus himself kind of brings this up when in John 10 where he's talking like he's in a debate I think with people about what gods are, and Jesus says, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? And this is true in the Old Testament. Yahweh called the Jews gods, and Jesus explains, if he called them gods, that is, to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be set aside, what about the one whom the Father sent apart from his very own, set apart as his very own and sent into the world? And so he's kind of saying like I am like God. But Jesus kind of references this theory that the ancient sons of Noah were deified because they had the promises of God. And so because their words had power and authority from God, they were confused as gods, even though they were just like minor people. In Hebrew, this
Mm.
kind of gets it's interesting because like in many Levantine languages, the word for God, the word for great man is the same. So they kind of it gets a bit confusing sometimes. And also the word for king and angel is virtually the same word. So the ancient people don't seem to have differentiated that well between the divine and the material. They kind of viewed it as like incarnations of like each other almost. Um
That
sorry, I'm
reminds
trying
me of yeah, that's I love that because Carlyle in his great man essay, he starts by he does what the Western mind is really good at. He tabulates, he distinguishes the king from the priest from the prophet.
yeah.
But it seems like in the ancient world, a lot of those things were sort of collapsed into the same function.
Yeah, and one of the things I like is that, so a lot of Orthodox consider Plato actually almost a saint because he seems to reference a three-person God in his writing. Um, and he actually says, I want to keep this secret in his writing. In his second epistle, Plato says, um, there is also another matter which he most certainly explained. Where is this? For according to his report, you say that you have not had sufficient demonstration of the doctrine concerning the nature of the first being like the first mover. Now I must expound to you in a riddling way, in order that should the tablet come into any harm in the ocean or on the earth, the reader might not understand. So Plato's actually trying to conceal this knowledge he's extracted from studying reality. He
And
doesn't want.
this is the philosopher Plato.
Yeah. He wrote a series of epistles that are pretty good. Um, so he says that the matter stands thus: related to the King of all are all things, and for his sake they are, and of all things fair. He is the cause. He related to the second, and related to the second are the second things, and related to the third. About these, then, the human soul strives to learn, looking to the things that are akin to itself. And so Plato's saying that there's these this like the high God is these three beings whom humanity seeks to relate to itself, which is kind of cool. It's like a proto Trinitarian almost.
That is
Um,
dynamite to me. I had no idea that Plato was on that.
yeah, and he goes on. He basically writes this like, um, yeah. Beware, however, lest these doctrines be ever divulged to uneducated people. For there are hardly any doctrines, I believe, which sound more absurd than these to the vulgar, or, on the other hand, more admirable and inspired to men of fine disposition. For it is through being repeated and listened to frequently for many years that the doctrines are refined at length, like gold with prolonged labor. But listen now to the most remarkable result of all. Quite a number of men there are who have listened to these doctrines, men capable of learning and capable of holding them in mind and judging them by all sorts of tests, and who have been hearers of mine for no less than 30 years and are now quite old. And these men now declare that the doctrines that they once held to be most incredible appear to them now most credible, and what then they held most credible now appears to be the opposite. So, bearing this in mind, take care lest one day you should repent what has now been divulged improperly. The greatest safeguard is to avoid writing and to learn by heart. So Plato's saying like you can't really explain the Trinity with words. You have to really like contemplate it.
This is like
Uh,
proto St. Paul.
yeah, many people have made the connection that Paul, being part Greek, probably studied this. He goes on to say yeah, he has this little in Timus, which is like
Oh,
Plato
yeah.
would he wrote these like kind of like pseudo dialogues to get ideas out.
Mm.
He says, the knowledge of other gods is beyond us, and we can only accept the traditions of the ancients who were the children of the gods. As they said, for surely they must have known their own ancestors. Although they give no proof, we must believe them as is customary. They tell us that Oceanus and Tethys were the children of earth and heaven, that Phaeus and Kronos and Rhea come in the next generation and were followed by Zeus and Hera, whose brothers and children are known to everybody. However, when the Father who begat the world, he's talking about God, like the high God now, when the Father who begat the world saw the image which he had made of the eternal gods, moving and living, he rejoiced, and in his joy resolved, since the archetype was eternal, to make the creatures eternal as far as was possible. There, Plato hints that gods aren't like the polytheist gods aren't actually immortal. They derive their livelihood from their father god. And he goes on, when all of them, both those who show themselves in the sky and those who retire from view, had come into being, the Creator addressed them thus: Gods, sons of gods, my works, if I will, are indissoluble. That which is bound may be dissolved, but only an evil being would dissolve that which is harmonious and happy. And although you are not immortal, you shall not die, for I will hold you together. Hear me then. 3 tribes of mortal beings have still to be created, but if I created them by me, they would be like gods. Do ye therefore make them. I will implant them with the seed of immortality, and you shall weave together the mortal and immortal, and provide food for them, and receive them again in death. Thus he spoke and poured the remains of the elements into the cup, in which he had mingled the soul of the universe. They were no longer pure as before, but diluted, and the mixture he distributed into souls equal in number to the stars, and assigned each a star. Then, having mounted them as a chariot, he showed them the nature of the universe and told them of their future birth and human lot. They were to be sown into the planets, and out of them was to come forth the most religious of animals, which would hereafter be called man. It's kind of a little bit. It almost sounds kind of like Genesis, where God blesses the sons of Noah to fill the earth,
It
and
sounds
he
like
would save them.
yeah, it
Yeah.
sounds like Genesis, and also the reference to the cup and the drink and the blood, and I think you mentioned blood. It's kind of I'm thinking mass as well.
Yeah, and so you see in Plato, I like Plato because he's kind of this bridge between the like post-Diluvian first generation to the classical world. Plato's somewhere I think in like the 800s BC or something. I forget, maybe 600s, and he's kind of like bringing up these myths that are dying out as the polytheists take over the city states, and he kind of wants to preserve this ancient idea of God, the high God, this Trinitarian God that blessed these created beings that the Greeks call gods but weren't really. Um, and he kind of says like, yeah, all gods will die because they're not really gods. They derive their longevity from God. And of course, in Genesis, we see that a lot of the first generation lived for centuries, but they did eventually die. The Greeks are especially interesting because prior to the Dorian invasion, the Dorians are like the Aryan kind of people from the north. They're like the steppe people. A lot of the I guess we'll say far right people who obsess about Yeah, like, they obsess about their Aryan steppe charioteers. Uh, you've probably seen a lot of the
Well,
Black
why
Widow.
wouldn't you, you know?
Yeah, so those people were the Dorians, and they invaded Greece from the north. But there was an older civilization, the Mycaeans and the going extinct Minoans, who were there before, and had they had basically the same gods as the Dorians, but an older version of them. So as the Dorians had people like Zeus and Hera, the Mycaeans had like what they would call Dios Petar and a Hero and stuff like that, like kind of like spelt differently. But basically the same like etymology. And the thing is, the Mycenaeans had tombs for these gods. These gods had lived and died amongst them. And on Crete, they had a tomb to Zeus. And when the Dorians invaded Greece and they found the graves of their gods, they were very upset. They were like, this is not right. And so in the early days of the Dorian conquests of Greece, they kind of tried to like erase the native religions. One of the things I find interesting is that the Titans that the Greek gods defeated actually have virtually the same names as the gods. So you have Ipeth rather than Iapeth, who has the same name as Diapeth, which is like Zeus's older name for the Dorians. And you have I think I forget the name for Hera, but it's basically the same. And then whereas the Dorians have Apollyon, the Apollo, the
Mm.
Mycenaeans have Hyperion. They H is a silent letter. H is an interesting letter that gets stacked on because in some cultures H is silent and in some cultures H is pronounced. So if you're conquered by a people that doesn't pronounce it, the H usually gets dropped. So when you drop Hyperion, you get Perion, which is actually the oldest version of Apollo's name. So my theory that I write about in Panchaea is that the reason why the Titans and the Greek and the Olympian gods have the same names is because when the Dorians conquered the Mycenaeans, they wanted to disassociate from these mortal gods who had died and place in place of them their immortal gods that were basically the same gods. And if you study it enough, you kind of start seeing how it connects to the sons of Noah. Like I think Diospetar or these are like older names for Zeus. The dy gets converted into a z from the Dorians. It's kind of like an accent difference. So Dios becomes Zeus. And Diospetar sounds very similar to the older way of saying well, obviously it sounds like Jupiter, and Jupiter is associated with that, but it also sounds like Yepetar, which is Japheth's Hebrew name. Japheth's our English pronunciation, but in Hebrew you say Yepeth. And Yepeth to Depeth is not that hard of a difference. So I actually think people like Zeus are probably just a misremembered Japheth, son of Noah. And his son Javan is associated with Ion, the one of the Greek tribes founders, who is also a son or grandson of Ipet the Titan, who has the same name as Zeus, the god. So it all gets muggled, mixed around. But if you go to the root of the etymological roots, those genealogies do overlap pretty well, and so it seems that the large amount of the Greek gods were the descendants of Japheth and that lineage of Noah.
Yeah.
That's my theory in Panchaea, and that was basically Euphemus. I forget his name again, the Greek philosopher. He was basically continuing that theory that the gods were just ancient kings. I bring this up a lot when I debate with pagans because it's kind of fun because like you don't have to like insult them. You can say, hey, your gods were great warriors. And the thing is, once those gods are understood as just ancient great warriors, all their deeds are within your grasp because they're just men. You can do the same thing. They don't have to be these like unfathomably above you beings that are beyond you. The things that they did, you can too. And I think that's very encouraging.
I mean, this is just there's so much to unpack there. There's so much I want to say. I suppose the first thing to say, and I mean this as a compliment, is that I feel like I've just been given a lecture by J.R.R. Tolkien, and I love Tolkien.
I do too. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I was actually having a conversation with okay, so the really good friend of mine, he's not a pagan, but he's best friends with a pagan.
Hmm.
And they recently went on some kind of a retreat. And anyway, this friend of mine, he came back to mine, and we sort of drank quite a lot of wine. And I basically said, rather lumpishly compared to everything you've just said, I wish I had these resources to draw on. I feel definitely like studying this in more depth, but I basically said, why why would Christ is God, like he's offering you eternal life, like why would you turn that down in favor of, you know you know capricious, sexually exploitative, pagan gods. And I kind of drew upon Chesterton's Everlasting Man stuff. That here's Bacchus or Dionysus or whatever. Turning grapes into wine like over the course of thousands of years, and Christ does it in an instant. Christ is the summation of all paganism, basically. But the question I want to ask you off the back of all this is, what does this do to Christianity? Um,
You know,
Are are
oh,
these
sorry. Mhm.
gods like, I don't know how to phrase it because you've I mean, I have to defer to your greater knowledge on this particular subject, but what does it do to Christianity in the sense of, obviously it doesn't challenge the monotheism of Christianity, but you have St. Paul talking about powers and principalities, and you mentioned angels and demons earlier. One of the questions I've been asking myself as a catechumen is, to what extent am I obliged to actually believe in the spiritual existence of angels and demons? And by extension, to what extent am I obliged, in the light of everything you've just said, to believe in, you know, lesser gods, as it were? How does all this affect your
Yeah.
faith, for instance?
Oh yeah, I definitely don't view them as lesser gods. Like Jesus said, if you receive a word from God, you have authority and power to use that word because God's word will always be successful. It's His promise. We know that different ancestors of ours received. We know the prophets are real. You could view what the Greeks called gods as what the Jews called prophets. They received a word from God to go out into the world and do a deed. And because the word came from God, it will be done. Um, and to that degree, you can kind of view uh, the hope that maybe God might choose you to receive a word to speak or do something in the world that will change it for the better. Um, and because within the Catholic faith, we have the faith that the saints are praying for us. We can say, "Hey, I come from this spiritual discipline that God's word continues past just the person who said the word." Now, there's a danger of that because you have a lot of those uh, what do you call it, prophet churches, uh, wealth churches, prosperity churches. That's the word I'm looking for.
Prosperity, yes, yes.
Yeah,
It's
because they
awful.
take they take the word of God and say, well, it applies to everyone. We all can be rich because God said we'll be rich.
I
There's no
I
concern
I
about
prefer to say they take the word of God and flush it down the toilet.
yeah, because like obviously God did not say everyone's going to be rich. He said that
I
you
think
might be
Christ was pretty unambiguous actually
yeah.
about the sin of being rich.
Yeah, and this is where discernment comes in. w- the Christian faith has perhaps lost a large amount of discernment in its ranks, and that's why these things keep growing. These movements keep growing, like not for long. They grow for a generation, and then when they prove false, they die off. Um, we know from discernment that when God sends a prophet, it's a very specific goal and a very specific end. It can be tested. If the prophet fails, his word clearly did not come from God, or it didn't come to true in that generation yet. Um, you know, again, I like the Book of Enoch, for example, because in that book there are pretty. It was written sometime around like 500 to 300 BC, probably close to 300 BC. There are in there certain phrases and promises of what the Messiah would be that are much more Christian than the warlord that the Jews were hoping for. Um, it also has an early description of the Trinity also. But in Enoch, God is described in three persons as the Ancient of Days, the Lord of Spirits, and the Son of Man. So you have Father, Son, and Spirit. And this is written 300 years before Jesus, so it's pretty cool. That like where this people were receiving from their prophets a description of the Trinity and who to look for when Christ came. And that's why Ethiopia converted so soon. They already knew what they were looking for. Um, but I think what you ask, what does the Christian faith? It allows us to know that we can be instruments of God. That's to be a saint. We can receive word from God, but we have to be discerning. We have to test it. We have to make sure that it's aligned with the scriptures, that it's beneficial to our neighbors and not just ourselves. There are certain things that the Gospels say to be aware of, because you can be deceived. Um, I know when I went through a phase of atheism in high school that ended pretty abruptly in college, contrary to the norm, because I had a few experiences related to this. There was this time in my sophomore year where I started. Well, in my freshman year, I kind of received I don't want to say vision, but like I had this really intense itch that to sit at a specific table at a specific time, like to the minute. I think it was like 5:57 or something, I forget. And I obeyed that sense. I was still kind of secular, but I was like, this is a weird feeling. I've never had this before. And at the exact minute, a Catholic friend of mine came by and invited me to pray. And for my mind, I was like, this itch was given to me to receive this blessing and confirm my faith. And that brought me back into having faith in the Christian faith. But I still didn't really believe in the Bible that well. I was like, okay, I believe that the Christian God's true, but I don't really trust this book. A year later, when I was going through it's not a breakup, but like a failed relationship, basically. Um, it was never a relationship to start with. I was kind of bitter and sad, and I got a different kind of itch. It was like this feeling that something was eating my bitterness, like feasting on my bitterness. And it lasted for a few days. It kind of felt like a dark cloud was over me. And after all my exams were done and I went home to bed, that night I kind of got this like sense that something was in my room, and then I started hearing noises like a poltergeist thing. And when I tried to see what it was, it kind of like struck me, like punched me and grabbed my neck and then disappeared. There's more to that story, but I don't want to really get into it right now. But essentially, I like kind of like I think it like grabbed my neck and I passed out. And then when I rewoke, I said a prayer and and tried to grab it, but was thrown back under my bed, but then it disappeared. So it's kind of a weird experience, like a poltergeist almost. And that experience and things continued for a while, very strange. Like I went to breakfast the next morning and light bulbs started falling from the ceiling. It was like very like literally Poltergeist the movie. And that made me pretty convinced that the spiritual world was real, and I needed to essentially go through a process of fasting and praying that I'd be protected from this thing, and it never happened again. But it was one of those experiences that I moved gradually to believe in the Christian faith, and then a year later accept the word of the Christian faith as true. And so, for speaking from my own experiences, what the Christian faith benefits from this view of history and time is that, like, yeah, it is a bit of a battlefield, and there are powers and principalities vying for power and control. For what ends, we don't necessarily know. You can guess maybe, but it's not clear. We just know that there's the enemy and there's our God, and our God's going to win in the end. And so we don't have to fear that enemy, but it's going to get dangerous sometimes, and you have to submit to essentially the church.
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely up to you if you want to divulge more about that episode or episodes, but it's kind of refreshing in a way to hear you say that at this particular moment in my life, because when I did that video of mine about demons and the culture war and stuff, I wasn't yet. I was a Christian, but I wasn't yet on the path of joining the swimming the Tiber. Um, and literally in the last couple of weeks, I have come more and more to believe wholeheartedly and sincerely in the existence of, you know, for lack of a better phrase, demons. Um, in other words, malicious spiritual powers who do not want you to be joined to God. And it's been quite, raised in a secular culture and a secular household, it's been quite unnerving coming to terms with that, especially with the approach of Halloween, because I know that different Catholic priests have different pronouncements on that. But it's been quite unnerving actually accepting that there are these forces at work who do mean you ill. I mean, I remember first reading C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters and thinking, "Oh, this is just a wonderful metaphor." But actually, I mean, your experience with this stuff sounds much more extreme than any of my experiences thus far. Touch
Yeah,
wood.
it was a decade ago, so I'm glad it never happened again. I've had like different kind of experiences, not as extreme as that, but there's always been a part of me that wonders if I was going crazy. But like, I'm the type of person to get a brain scan to see if I have a tumor because I am at my core very still. There's still that little atheist in me from when I was younger that tries to interpret these things materially, but if it passes all the safeguards and it can't really be explained materially, uh, don't really know how to explain that. You know, there have been other experiences where you can't to me, you have to differentiate, is it only in your mind or does it affect people around you? Because if it affects people around you, then it's something spiritual that's beyond like, your mind's ability to fabricate things, right? Um,
Yeah.
so I've had things which have affected other people around me. Like, in my freshman year, I was interested in not freshman year, sophomore year, somewhere around the same time as this stuff was happening. I was interested in someone else, and I remember very vividly hearing, "Don't date this person; they're going to lose their faith in a year." I heard those words in my prayer, and I was very confused. But sure enough, 2 years later, she left the faith. How do I explain that? How do I really explain that predictive power? Other times when like one of my friends got into a really, really bad skateboard accident. I didn't know, but that morning I woke up and I just knew someone had been hurt, and so I said a prayer.
Did that matter to you, the former instance,
And
because you didn't want to date, are you still there?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I thought I'd lost you. Did that matter to you, that the former instance, because you didn't want to date someone who had lost the faith? Like, you wouldn't be comfortable dating someone who wasn't Catholic?
I debate why I was told that. Was I told that because I could have done something and it didn't, or was I told that because I couldn't do something and I didn't want to? God didn't want me in that situation. I don't know.
Mm.
I've often debated in my head if I was told that because I should have said something or done something to help their faith, but I didn't, and I kind of have a little bit of guilt about that. Um, but I've had moments like that in my life where a kind of like a direct intervention of a word has proven true, and it couldn't have been just something my mind made up because it was beyond my mind. It was involving someone else. And so that's kind of I've tried to be a cessationist, like explain it all away as just happenstance, chance, God doesn't intervene, but it keeps happening like that. And I'm just like, well, there's clearly a guardian angel whispering me little hints of what to do and not to do, and so far it's protected me from turmoil. And so I can only say thank you, God, and hopefully that continues protecting me.
Yeah, well, there's another confluence, the idea of the guardian angel and the daemon that Socrates was convinced was speaking to him. But it's refreshing talking to you about these things in particular because you just mentioned, there's that little uh, young Ælþemplær atheist in your head still seeking the material explanation. Um, I often find it very difficult to talk to atheists about a lot of these topics now because, but I mean, my best friend is an atheist and a materialist. Um, and he's good at arguing the case, but I just you reach a point at which for me, atheism is so profoundly intellectually unsatisfactory that you reach a point where you run out of things to say.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna run to the bathroom real quick. Do you mind if I just disappear for 30 seconds?
Go for it, yeah, go for
Sorry.
it. Well, we are live, folks, and my guest has run off to the loo, which is perfectly fine. I mean, if this were pre-recorded, I would have hit pause, and you wouldn't have known the difference. But we are live, so this is just one of the things you're going to have to lump it. I suppose I should take this opportunity to thank everyone who's subscribed to my Substack and to my YouTube channel. I lost one of my greyhounds a couple of weeks ago, which is why I haven't been able to upload as much on my Substack as I would have liked. Um, it was pretty fucking awful. Like she was technically my ex's dog. I'm still really good friends with my ex, but we got her together. Her name was Tia. She was an ex-racing greyhound, and she was just like she brought such joy into our lives, and she died during a routine operation a couple of weeks ago, and I was in no state to write anything for a while. So apologies for the relative paucity of Substack articles, but I've genuinely been overwhelmed and humbled by the degree of financial and just like solidarity style support that's emerged from my Substack thing, Platoon Post. Like I never expected to have as many readers or subscribers as I do now. So yeah, greatly humbled. But yeah.
My apologies.
No, it's fine. I had a good interlude where I was thanking my Substack subscribers and explaining why I hadn't written as much for a couple of weeks. One of my dogs died a couple of weeks ago, so yeah, I was just explaining that sitch, as we say in Essex.
Yes. Unfortunately, I have one negative side effect when I have a good cigar, and that is that my body gets that nicotine out very fast.
Well, I'm not gonna begrudge any of my guests on this show for drinking or smoking, unless it's drugs. I'm very anti-drugs. But, anyway,
Yes.
I wanted to ask, does any of this have any relevance to a phrase? I've held on to I wrote it down with my lovely fountain pen. Um, you said earlier, you used the phrase carrying and or preserving, I can't remember what you said, the fire, and you said you were gonna come back to that. Does
Oh,
that ring any bells,
may
or
may
is that relevant to this discussion?
yeah, I mean, I was thinking more about the phrase, "The thing points to itself," that I was thinking about earlier, but,
Oh, okay.
um, no, I mean, like, I guess, like, I do think that, like, there's this faith is often associated with the idea of a fire because it's, eh, the fire of the Holy Spirit and stuff like that, and
It's like that
I
Cormac McCarthy book, The Road, right? Have you read that?
I've watched the movie, but I haven't read the book.
Yeah, he just repeats that phrase over and over again. Like the father is like, "We've got to carry the fire. We've got to carry the fire." And you read it back. Well, I read it back all these years later, and I'm thinking, "Holy shit, that's a Christian book in a way."
Yeah, I do view that as, like, one of the reasons why I don't like the anti-works stuff in Protestantism is I really think you do have to do works to preserve faith. Because if you just like say you believe something and then are never tested or succeed in a test or trial, it seems as though your faith remains either infantile or non-existent. Paul says a phrase like you start with with like the breast milk and then you get to the meat of faith, and it's really important to see how you grow as a person. Like when I started taking that to heart, I did find myself very strong at resisting sins. Um, like I'm one of the I guess in the tradcath sense, I have become one of those people that abhors and doesn't fall into like things like pornography anymore. I have other sins I have to fight now because once you defeat the simple sins, you have to fight more advanced sins.
It's been
But
exactly the same for me. Yeah, but the whole pornography thing, as soon as I started taking my my faith seriously, like that shit went right out the window almost instantly.
yeah, and so the fire of faith needs to be preserved in the sense of like keep the fire clean, keep the fire fed. Um, and I don't know, like I know what the scriptures say about the dangers of getting too obsessed about works. I do think you have to like ask God regularly for faith. And sometimes that comes in the form of works to build up and confirm your faith. Like I haven't done a whole lot of volunteering for the poor in a while, and I feel bad about that. I feel like that's something I have to do more. I used to do a lot of soup kitchens and I'd go down to DC and take care of like fatherless black kids in DC. And I really enjoyed teaching them life lessons and getting their lives together very young. I had this very lovely memory of when I volunteered in DC. There are these two half brothers arguing with each other and hating each other. And when I asked why, I set them down and asked them why. And They were like, "Oh, we're not the same blood," because like they had different fathers. And it was a great opportunity to just talk about the blood of Christ covering us all and being in us all. It's like what makes us a Christian family. And they stopped fighting and actually became quite good for the rest of the time I was there. Like once they received that word of God, it kind of fixed their generational sin. Um, and I have a great desire to go back to that, but I haven't really done that a lot. And so for me, like my fire is a little bit dimmed because I haven't done that for a while. I haven't like witnessed the word of God fixing generational sins and broken families in a while because I haven't been volunteering very much anymore. Um,
Can I
yep,
very briefly just insert an observation there,
yeah,
which is that, so using you say there were half brothers, sort of running with that, I'm sure you're aware that there's a trend on the broad sort of internet/dissident right, which has become quite ethno-nationalist, and I think it's because they're more pagan than they are Christian. I don't think they're Christian
yeah,
at all,
yeah,
and I think, yeah, the antidote to that, like, I find that really uncomfortable, when I first began moving in these circles, like, quite, you know, um quite unconsciously began to sort of enter those circles online. I was quite sort of taken aback by that rhetoric, and I think the faith, broadly speaking, is the antidote to that. Um, and you just reminded me of that.
yeah.
A
I've
lot of the
noticed
right
that.
online is
Yeah,
pagan, basically.
it is, and I have noticed that. I do tend to be a hybrid in that approach where it's probably best to sort your own house before you sort someone else's house. And so right now, like, a lot of white people in Britain and America they are they are broken people. They have no future. They don't really have any hope of a future, unfortunately. They're out of the like patronage of their government and they're kind of like cast aside. And so I do take pity on them because they are abandoned right now. Like 10 years ago when I was volunteering in DC, yeah, the black kid in DC was kind of hopeless. Now he's a bit more on a pedestal and so does have more of an ability to get further. So maybe one day I'll change directions. But I do have a concern, like you said, where like there's this very weird like ethnic component growing in the right wing in America. And it's kind of weird because America especially is like, I mean, like we're all mutts other than a small amount of like Anglos in the South, basically. Um like this like I'm a mixture too, like I've said in my posts, like I've and that's just like the majority. I'm mostly Irish and Ukrainian Jew, but there's more in that that's like Greek and other bits. When I did DNA test, it said I was mostly just Greek. So, uh,
Yeah, no,
but
I'd say the same for myself, just briefly again, sorry I keep interrupting you, but
no,
exactly the same for myself. My dad often says to me, you've got blood like a packet of Smarties," 'cause my mum was born in Papua New Guinea, and most of her family are, like, Polynesian, like, her twin sister
mm,
is basically black. You wouldn't think it to look at me because I seem to have inherited more of my dad's genes. I mean, not literally, but yeah. No, I get your situation.
yeah. So it is a concern to me a little bit, and it's a growing concern. In my opinion, it's like there's ethnic joking that is fine. So like I have plenty of like I joke a lot about the Jewish side a lot on Twitter, like way too much. Uh but once you can tell when someone's got hate in their heart on that matter. Like there's a difference between just joking, like in your neck of the woods, joking between Northerners and Southern English or Scottish and English. Like there's the joking, and then there's the legitimate hate that like is just spoiling someone's soul.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's the hate that's really concerning. Uh, like we have an immigration crisis right now in New York, and a lot of people are angry because hotels are being turned into uh, immigration housing or migrant housing,
It's
and
all happening here too, I assure you.
yeah, and so there's a bit of a housing crisis, and you have these NGOs that will buy a dead boomer's house and then move in like 5 families illegally. And in my neighborhood especially, I've seen like the native Italian population be basically replaced by Muslims and Chinese, and so there's a lot of ethnic tension that causes that. In that regard, I almost think that there's a bit of a left wing solution there, where that this isn't the the consequence of those people. Those people didn't plan to replace you. They didn't plan to compete with you. That's the fault of your government. The people in charge are doing that to you because they hate you.
Yep.
So a large time, many times it's misguided hate, where like those problems, you're not going to solve any of those problems hating those people. There, that literally does nothing. It's wasted effort. It's the people that hate you at the top, that are doing that want to replace you with cheap labor and uneducated people. They're the people you should hate, if anybody. They're the people that want to destroy you. These random third worlders, they don't have any connection to the land. You can move them anywhere. If based world happens and whatever idea of a leadership happens, you can literally just move them anywhere because they don't have any roots in the community. It doesn't matter.
Based world.
Based world is a term that a lot of the right wingers in America use as like a hypothetical future government.
I've never heard of
It's like,
that before, but it sounds vaguely terrifying.
yeah, so they call Fuentes group of 1488 takes over and he creates base world or something. It's like
Oh god, I hate that guy.
you know,
I hate that guy.
yeah, me too. And so like it's just a joke. It's a joke term for like, when base world happens. It's like, when
Yeah,
hell freezes over. It's basically one of those phrases that means when hell freezes over.
I see.
So like whenever, if they were able to get the government they want, it would not be hard to move everybody to somewhere else without any like anger or destruction, because they don't have any roots in the community anyway. They're just like plug and play people that the government put in. So there's literally no reason to hate these people. It's a complete waste of energy and emotion. There's no reason to. The effort and the hate should be placed onto the people doing it to you at the top in the government. And the thing is, a large amount of this stuff has its roots in America's like informal caste system. When the South was colonized, you had the English aristocracy and then the lowborn English like mob, and that was basically your southern population. The aristocrats were worried that the mob might one day get radical and pull a French Revolution or something over them. And well, it was before the French Revolution, but there were other case studies in history that they might have been afraid of. And so in their minds, they thought, well, what can we do to keep the common people distracted from hating us? And one of their solutions was slavery. You bring in a random group of third world people that live side by side with the lower caste. Inevitably, the lower caste is going to hate this foreign group instead of the aristocrats. And so the bringing in of slaves was much more about social stability than it was about profit. It was to create a caste divide between the slaves and the low caste, have them fight over each other over jobs and profits and stuff like that. And then the aristocrats can just make money on both. That was basically the Southern strategy for social stability. In many ways, the government, the United States, importing third worlders to distract these like, I call them the schizophrenic right. But like, the Fuentes types hate the third world types because as long as they're hating each other, the Democrat Party can keep extracting wealth, basically. And so again, there's literally no reason to hate these people that are coming into your communities because A, you can move them, B, they're literally a distraction so you don't bother the people at the top. And 3, they could potentially be allies because you probably have your morals probably align more to the random Mexican kid than with the secular progressive in power,
I was just about to say, yeah. I mean, back in the sort of, you didn't really see it in the 80s. I mean, I wasn't alive in the 80s, but from what I've been able to gather, but certainly like from the 90s onwards in Britain, and let me know if there's any sort of similarity with America here. But in the 90s, you've got like parties like the BNP, the British Nationalist Party, gain. I mean, they never got into Parliament, but they did get some like local council seats. What you have is you've got portions of the local population with legitimate, like, you know, legitimate gripes, hating Johnny Foreigner, as we say here, but never directing their anger to the government. But what you've seen in Britain as time has gone on is that more and more people are beginning to realize that, as you've just laid out, like the real locus of animosity here is at the government. It's not at the people who just happen to be different from you, who live in the same neighborhood as you. Like, they are obeying exactly the same economic incentives that you are. They're just coming from a different place. But the reason they're there is because they have been facilitated to be there by the people who govern you, who happen to hate you. And you do see that emerging in modern British culture and sort of non-mainstream media. There's this growing sort of, not to sound too much like a Marxist, but there's this growing sort of class consciousness that um, that's the real dynamic. That's actually the real friend-enemy distinction, in a way that the people who govern you are not actually your friends. And there's sort of parallel to that. You see a lot of for lack of a better phrase, interfaith dialogue, um, which I think Blair must have surely have invented. um, Between, conservative Christians and conservative Muslims. Like, I'm not sure if you're aware, there was this case in, I think it was Birmingham, but actually there have been there've been many cases like this. So, basically, it's mostly in the north of England. You've got like primary schools and secondary schools will teach very progressive forms of sex ed, and the people who are most vocal against it isn't that it's not the local Catholic church, although they should be. It's the local Muslim parents who are sending their Muslim children to that school. They're the ones, demonstrating outside saying this is unacceptable. And the progressives are sort of stuck in a, they don't they don't know where to turn, because on the one hand, their philosophy is that these people, Muslims in this case, are downtrodden and should be protected. But on the other hand, they completely disagree with the Muslims' teachings on sex. So you've got this weird kind of mishmash going on, this stew of contradictions, but it does
Yeah.
highlight the dynamic you've been explaining.
They've been dumping a large amount of Somalians in the Rust Belt in Michigan and Ohio, and it's funny because as their populations grow, and in one town the Somalians took over the city council basically, and the first thing they did is ban pride marches.
I mean, that kind of you said very much earlier in the conversation, you mentioned something about Christian leadership, like the duty of Christian leaders in a contemporary society is to check the lords. Um, and I remember thinking at the time, I didn't say, like, if only Christian leaders in the West were willing to make the kind of stands Muslim leaders in the West do frequently make the stand for, like, can you imagine, like, the is it Vincent Nichols, the head of Catholics in Britain, basically, Cardinal Nichols, can you imagine him coming out and just, like, castigating Boris Johnson for having had, like, 5 kids out of
Yeah.
wedlock or something?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he is part Ottoman, so it's kind of it's tradition. No, I mean, like a good example of how to solve this is the Ottoman Empire, where you had all these different ethnic groups essentially work together to bring down the Ottoman Empire. And the thing is, they, for the most part, with a few exceptions in the Balkans, because the Balkans are always an exception, uh, all those ethnicities preserved their historic land after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. They all agreed to divide that empire up to their historic borders. So as far as I could, and there were like millions of people like forced march between different ethnic communities basically, because after like 500 years of Ottoman Empire rule, a large amount of drift had happened. But for the most part, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire is a great example of why this ethnic tension is a farce. Like, if you can have the Greeks and Turks and Egyptians and Syrians all mutually agree on their borders and preserving their people and moving people between each other, I don't see why we can't. Like, these are like the most disparately different religious and cultural groups and languages, and yet they all managed to get along for the most part with where the borders lay after the empire fell. Yeah, Greece didn't get a few islands, and Egypt had its problems, but for the most part, you have ethnic heritage preserved by working together rather than fighting each other, right? When the Greeks and the Turks and the Egyptians and the Syrians were fighting each other, the Ottoman Empire was strongest. When they all worked together to break up that empire and preserve their lands, they all ended up better for it and preserved their people better for it. So I kind of don't see the point of ethnic violence between the subjects that the government brings in, because those are all potential allies to break up this disaster of a government. Um,
So,
I also
um, sorry, no, do go on.
no, I just want to bring up that it reminds me a lot of Isaiah 28. There's a part in Isaiah 28 where God is kind of upset that the priests have. Well, he's not kind of. He's very upset that the priests have failed their duties to keep the lords in check. And one of the curses God lays on Israel is actually mass migration as a sign that they have lost the divine mandate. God says, "Very well, then, with foreign lips and strange tongues, God will speak to this people." And it goes on, but it's basically like I am going to bring better people than you because you failed your duties. Mass migration only happens because a community has been destroyed. And so, if you want to stop mass migration, the best thing you can do is to build a strong community that can advocate for itself rather than embrace this weird hyper individualist capitalist society that just unitizes it, turns you into a building like a changeable gear in a machine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
fungible economic actors, basically.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
that is one reason I sort of begrudgingly admire contemporary Muslims in the West, certainly in Britain. I mean, there is. I remember reading articles recently about this, that there is a kind of, and this has been tracked like statistically. I don't have the statistic to hand, but there is a portion of Muslim youth who are sort of moving away from Islam and is becoming subsumed into that greater sort of globo homo project. But by and large, Muslims are pretty good at holding on to the faith in the face of that dispensation, and I kind of admire that about them. They're very obstinate. But how would that work? What you were saying before, in a
Y-
nation state, because obviously the Ottoman Empire was an empire, right? It
mhm.
collapses, and you've got these different ethnic holdouts. But how would that work in Britain or the United States? Because we're still unitary political um, things. We're still unitary political entities. Um, how would
I,
that
I,
supposing nation states
Mhm.
broke down? Because I'm not sort of wedded to democracy in some grand sense. I know for some people, democracy is like invoking the creed. I think democracy has its virtues, but I'm not like I'm wedded to democratic um, characteristics. I'm not wedded to democracy with a capital D. So,
Yeah.
casting ahead into the future, and I do want to come on to the future because you wrote a really good essay about spacemen. Um, how would that work?
And honestly, I don't know for sure about Britain. America is it's never really been one country. It's several countries that are pasted together. Um, I mean, America. I think you're going to end up with a situation where the cities become. Uh, there's a term that my friend came up with: re, re, reparations for repatriation.
I love
And
it. It's a real
and this,
mouthful, but,
essentially, you just pay these people to go home. That's it. You just pay them to go home. Uh, it's financially incentivize them to go home, and they'll
but
go.
every time that's been floated by anyone in Britain, they've immediately been accused of being Hitler.
Well, Hitler killed people. I just want to pay them to leave. Right? It's like, yeah, that's all the left can do. All they can do is just scream Hitler. But ultimately, if you provide, it's probably going to come significantly from private actors paying for people to go home. It's probably not going to come from the government. Um, but that's the only solution I can say. Let's see, reparations for repatriation. America actually has a pretty good setup for this already because we founded Liberia, the country, and Liberia to this day has in its constitution the right of citizenship for any African American that wants to go home. And so the United States can literally just pay someone to go home and they're instantly a citizen with full rights in Liberia. And many Africans do this regularly because they view it as like a country of their own. In the past, since the Marxist revolution, it's been not so great. But unfortunately, our government actually helped that Marxist revolution happen because we were dumbasses in the 1970s. Um, but yeah, I mean, like to me, I kind of view the English American heritage as really only being in like the South and New England and the Midwest. I kind of do view the Midwest as, I mean, that's clearly Hispanic. It's always been Hispanic. That's just, those are Latin Americans. They always were and they always will be. You can't fix that. As a matter of fact, if you actually look, there's a lot of times these people that argue for like ethnic stuff. They'll say, "Oh, look how white California used to be. It was like 80% white." But if you actually go down the Census Bureau, you'll discover that they didn't even have Latino as a category until like the 1970s. And if you look at the last names of marriages and everything, it was basically always 40% Spanish. It was never actually majority English. This is just a farce that the ethnicists brought up. California's always been a majority Latin-speaking cultural hub. Same with the Southwest. Texas is a bit of a hybrid culture between, you know, Tex-Mex. But to me, I think that any future America that tries to right these wrongs has to have in its written constitution where the homeland of like English Americans are, where the homeland of German Americans are. They have to be defined cultural hubs and borders that say this is for them, this is their community. They can create their local governments, and that will just be the way it is forevermore. You know, I'm a New Yorker. I'm from various Eastern European groups. I know I'm not English American. I know I'm not of that tribe. So when I visit the South, I know I'm in a foreign country within the United States, and I respect them as that. I don't hate Confederates or whatever because of some weird history that the Yankees want you to hate. No, like, this is their homeland. This is where they built their culture and heritage, and they own that land. Until language, basically until the idea of a nation state, even within an empire like the United States, it comes back, it's going to be hard to do that. But you basically have to beat it into the leftist head. No, this is Anglo land, that is Mexico land, that is, you know, African American land, that is German American land. Those are their lands, and no matter how much you want to call people Hitler and be angry about it, too bad, it's their lands. You don't get to say no.
Yeah, and to bring this back to faith, I mean, this comes back to what you were saying about different liturgies for different sort of ethnic groups. I've written down in my notes here because I'm jotting furiously because you throw out so many interesting points. Uh, Solution to geographical balkanization, Catholicity. You know, because I was
Yeah,
thinking about orthodoxy. I mean, I attended an Orthodox church out of curiosity for a couple of months in Colchester, which is, funnily enough, the oldest recorded town in England. It's you know, proper Roman fort town, and sort of as a symptom of the decline of the Church of England, their church is a former Church of England church. You just completely abandoned by the Church of England congregation. You know, so it was bought by the Orthodox, the Antiochian communion or whatever, and they were like the Antiochian sect. I'm just throwing these words out because I can't think of anything better. But the Antiochian sect in Britain is like considered to be the most English form of orthodoxy. But
oh
even
yeah, that's because
in
the Crusades, right?
sorry,
But I think there's a weird mix. The English have owned different islands like Malta and other areas for a while, so there's a weird like crossover with the English there. But anyway, sorry, just a thought.
well, yeah, I mean, even in this most English of Orthodox churches, the majority of people there were Ukrainian, Russian, Romanian,
Yeah.
you know, and then one guy from like Clacton-on-Sea, you know. Um, and I kind of felt like I was playing cultural fancy dress, which I think is one of the reasons I personally couldn't be Orthodox. I just it's so I adore the Divine Liturgy, but it's I just didn't feel like I could be unconsciously prayerful because I was constantly like trying to do all these things to fit in. Um, and so, you know, to go back to this political discussion, the ethnic balkanization of the United States, the ethnic balkanization of Britain, which to a large extent has already happened in both cases. One of the faith solutions to that, not to sound too much like I'm hosting a synod on synodality, um, is the Catholicity of the Catholic Church. You know, I love that idea that you could go to any one of these places and duck into a church, and you'd basically you'd be dispensed the same faith and the same deposit of the same faith.
Yeah, and a lot of times people sometimes fear balkanization, but I don't really see why a people group cannot grow infinity. That's like line go up thinking. People groups will expand to a certain amount, and then just by sheer geographical difference and environmental differences, they will start to diverge.
When you say
This
people groups, do you basically mean in-group and out-group?
Yeah, maybe. You can apply it to multiple things. Like I'm a New Yorker, and I find myself probably I probably would have a lot in common with someone from Chicago, but not much in common with someone from like Boston, because Chicago and New York have a history together, but Boston is a different thing. Even though Boston's closer, it's such a geographical and cultural difference to New York. It's a different thing.
So
Whereas Chicago,
do you identify as a New Yorker before an American?
yeah, definitely. Because you know I'm from this place. I grew up in this place. I know everything about this place. I couldn't tell you anything about, say, Virginia or Louisiana. Those are almost they are different countries to me. They're different parts of the country, but I don't know anything about them. I don't know many people from there, and I don't have much. Like if you dump me in Louisiana, I wouldn't know what to do or where to go. But dump me in Chicago, and I know how to get back to New York.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because my grandfather, God rest his soul, I mean, he fought in the Second World War. He was born in the 1920s. He once waved to Churchill.
Nice.
Um, he was this just extraordinary man and the closest thing to an incarnation of Socrates I've ever encountered. And I once asked him when I was first becoming politically conscious, and not long before he died, um, "Grandad, do you consider yourself British or English?" And he said, "British, obviously." Like, this just the question was totally like, it was almost a stupid question to him. Whereas if you asked me, I would say, "No, I very much identify as English, not British." Quite, I'm quite clear on that. And I wonder, maybe would your well, I mean, okay, your ancestry, you've already conceded that your ancestry is a little bit, well, I mean, it's fascinating and it's complicated, but I wonder if former Americans would have been more comfortable with saying, "I am an American," maybe in a particular era, like 1950s and 60s in particular, or 70s, Reagan, 80s. And maybe more and more
Yeah,
Americans are saying, "No, I am Virginian, I am a Yankee, I am this."
yeah. In American history, that alternates back and forth. Um, I know in the 50s and 60s and a little bit in the 80s, it was definitely more like of an like British and American are more like imperial identities, whereas like New Yorker or English are more like subsidiary identities. And depending on the strength of that empire, you'll get a preference for one or the other. So like at the height of the American Empire in like the 60s and 70s, people are calling themselves American. But if you go back a generation in like the 1920s, let's say, uh, Americans would sometimes associate themselves with cities or regions. And in the Civil War, they would go by states only. Um, and it really depends. And you can kind of pick it up a little bit with the accent. Like large portions of like Los Angeles have a New York accent because a large portion of people moved there when the city was growing, and so they were initially viewing themselves as like Manhattan on the west, and then they started diverging over time because Los Angeles really is its own thing. Um, a different climate, different language, different neighbors, and so they became Los Angelers. Um, I think that again, like that does change over time. I've definitely seen that in England too, where like the older people view themselves as British, and the younger people have started viewing themselves as part of what's left of the British Empire, right? Like by their local identity. I tend to be more of a fan of local identity because when you say you're English, it has linguistic and cultural uh, applications. But when you say you're British, you kind of like, well, what does that mean? It means it may not. In some cases, it may not even mean you're from the island because in the 1940s and 30s, you could be British and be in Australia or be in Canada, but you're still British. Um, Again, those are not very. Those kind of terms don't tend to last very long anyway. So you might as well try to make it as local as possible to make it enduring and create a heritage for someone. Um, yeah, it's a hard thing to wrap my mind around myself because
when I'm traveling throughout the country, I'm definitely a New Yorker first, and in some neighborhoods, I don't even feel like I'm in the same country, and then anymore. Like I remember when I went down south for like one of the first times. I whenever I go to the south, people are always very much so more friendly than me, and I can tell I'm in a different culture and there are different norms. So if a girl wants to talk to me, I don't assume they're interested in me because they're just friendly in the south. But in the north, if someone starts talking to me for a while, I think, well, is this person interested in me? Because ordinarily people just don't talk that much to each other in New York. So if I'm observing different cultural practices in different regions, it's a different identity.
Yeah, it's kind of the opposite here. It's if you go north, and I've had this experience. I've only been north a few times, and Scotland twice, but people really do go out of their way to talk to you. Like they just come up to you and talk to you. Whereas down south, and it's not just in London. I mean, like it's easiest to treat London as just a separate country at this point because it really does function as one economically and culturally. But where I live in the southeast, if you're like sitting on a bench and someone comes up to you or even sits remotely near you, um, it's like weird. You just don't do that down south, but up north people do. And yeah, as you say, you adjust your expectations accordingly.
Yeah. Um, Sorry, I'm at end of what to talk about next.
No,
Pick a
that's
topic.
fine. So yeah, I want to. I mean, I've taken up a lot of your time already, so I suppose we're in the wrapping up stage.
Mhm.
Um, I want to at the end. I definitely want to come on to something very particular at the very end. But just before we get there, the sort of penultimate point I want to make, or the question, is to return to faith, as we must always. How do you navigate the controversies currently going on in the Catholic Church? And I don't say this from a partisan point of view. I know a lot of people get a lot of airtime on YouTube from sifting through the Pope's comments and tweets and all this. So I'm not interested in any of that. But when you look at the state of the Catholic Church at the moment, particularly with you kind of alluded to this earlier with the trad cats, the sort of liturgy wars and everything. What advice would you give? And I'm sort of referring to myself partly here as well, rather self-servingly, because you're ahead of me on this path. But what would you say to those of us who are discerning the Catholic faith, but are really put off by what they might see as the betrayal of that faith by its own leaders? Has this
Uh,
impacted you in any way?
yeah, I love history, so I can always draw from it for examples. I think I'd look at the examples between uh Pope Alexander something or other, the Borgia Pope from, and then his one of his successors. I think his name was Julius, so Julian the Pope. Um, Julian was the warrior pope. He was one of the last popes to ride out in armor. So, um,
I love it.
Alexander Borgia, the pope, he was pretty vile. Probably the worst pope in history. Not because of what he taught, but because of how he behaved. He's also the pope that condemned slavery as a vice and advised the Spanish not to do it in the New World. So he still followed the opinions of the bishops, but on a private life, this guy was a sodomizer, probably a pedophile, known to throw orgies in the Vatican, like confirmed by other bishops that he was doing this. He was hated by people in the Vatican too because he was just a filthy man, and it was strongly suspected that he bought the papacy through corruption. He didn't actually get elected. His Not the immediate successor, but two popes after him, Julian, whatever his name is. This pope was originally supposed to be the pope by legitimate election. He was the one who Alexander stole the papacy from. So when he became pope finally at a much more advanced age, he decided he would spend the last years of like he finally did get the papacy, but he was late and advanced in years, and he decided he would spend those years destroying and erasing the legacy of this awful pope. He went so far as to condemn that pope to hell. He said that pope is in hell. Like he made it an official proclamation of the Vatican that pope has gone to hell. So and this is a pope that wasn't that bad. In large portions, in large ways, the initial success of the Reformation was because the papacy was a mess at that time. So it's not that it doesn't have any effect on the church, but the popes were in a state of civil war essentially. And Julianus, he fought to try and restore what was lost by Alexander and did a lot of stuff. But ultimately, it is kind of Catholic doctrine that at least one pope is in hell. So, like, and that's not. I don't think that's a terrible thing. I think that's an honest fact, and it's maybe even a testimony that the church endured that and was able to repair itself from that. I think people view the Pope as this person who's supposed to be perfect and like a paragon of the faith, but that has not often been the case. It's more often the case that they're faulty people with vices and errors. But the way in which the Catholic Church determines doctrine is through consensus of the bishops. The Pope is really just the person who proclaims what the bishops decide. He's not the one who actually sets policy. Even if the Pope were to make a declaration, he has to do so with the permission of the bishops, if I remember correctly.
Well, I hope he's not listening to the German bishops. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Well, the German bishops are going to get excommunicated last time I heard. But I would say if you have concerns about the Pope himself, bear in mind that his power is limited within the structure of the church. He's considered kind of like he's more similar to the Speaker of the House than the Prime Minister, if that makes sense. He sets the tone and he authorizes what the bishops want, and he kind of keeps decorum going, right? The role of the Pope is really more like the Speaker of the House, in both in the US and UK example. So once you understand what his role is, where he's more of the voice of the consensus than his own authority, you start to understand how tradition and scholarship play a much more prominent role in Catholic doctrine than just the willy-nilly opinion of a single man. And, like the Pope himself, the position of the Pope has only ever made firm declarations, I think, on like 2 topics. That Mary was, I think it's Mary was a virgin, and that she was ascended to heaven. When they say ascended to heaven, they even allow the girth of belief, the width of belief, that you can believe Mary died and then was ascended to heaven. You only have to believe that her body was ascended to heaven. You don't have to believe that she herself was alive when she ascended. So it's a very like broad church approach in that way.
Would that be the Immaculate Conception before
I think
the
so.
previous example? Yeah.
I think so. It's either perpetual virginity or Immaculate Conception. I don't know.
One of the two.
And I would say that like the fact that in 2,000 years of history they've only made like 2 official like from the seat of the papacy official doctrines from that is a pretty good example of how the bishops and the Pope relate to each other and keep each other in check. And there are plenty of examples of history of where this goes more faithfully. There's a famous example, I think, in the 2nd or 3rd century where the Pope died and there was a debate of who the next Pope was going to be. And so Rome elected its own Pope with like 2 or 3 bishops. And the Bishop of Carthage, aware that this was an improper election of the Pope, vetoed Rome's decision. Because he was considered like an there are certain cities whose bishops are considered like of sufficient authority that they can like suggest, hey, this is wrong, and Carthage was one of those. I don't know if it is anymore because the Islamic conquest kind of destroyed it, but the Bishop of Carthage determined that this was incorrect, and so he rallied the bishops in France or at that time Gaul and other places, and they basically forced a proper election involving all the bishops and replace that faulty Pope out. So these people take their faith seriously, and they have a pretty good heritage and history of making sure things are done right. And I think that's why the church has lasted for so long and has spread so far. It doesn't really fall into the Protestant category of like lone elders ruining a church and stuff like that. I think if you don't like some of the things that Pope Francis says, and you might disagree with him politically and stuff like that, ultimately his power is limited, and his opinion isn't law. It has to go through the bishops. It has to be essentially, it has to be found and debated. I don't want to say debated like it's a democracy, because no one's, bishops aren't elected; they're selected, and so it seems to have been a good job at like curtailing any excesses and vices. In my opinion, all the faults of the Catholic Church in the 1500s seem to have been mostly weeded out by the 1800s. I did a post on Twitter that got something like 200,000 views on no, it got like 600,000 views. It was a really big post about, like, for example, you might remember a while back the French government said that there had been like hundreds of thousands of victims of sexual assault. If you actually investigate if you actually investigate the data, they had like 100 cases, and they projected from those 100 cases, oh, there must be like 100,000 victims or something. It was kind of wild conjecture, and it really wasn't accurate at all.
Yeah,
A large time,
I do remember seeing that.
yeah, a large time, the criticisms of the church seem to fall down when you actually look at the facts. Yes, the Catholic Church has had a history of problems with like pedophilic priests, but never to the extent that they claim, like that is. The data just doesn't back it up. They had like 100 cases of the entirety of France, and the data goes back to like 1945. So in like 60 years, in the entire country of France, there were like 100 abuse cases. Somehow from that, they projected like hundreds of thousands of abuses. It's ridiculous.
And I do feel morally obligated to point out as well that the very people who would be most eager to find those cases out are also the kind of people who would probably be okay with drag time story hour and its sort of
Yeah,
tendencies. Yeah.
yeah. So it's then that your friends anyway. And there's a pretty good like there's a support structure within the Catholic Church to criticize the church. I usually give the example. There's this guy who criticized Vatican II, but he did it through an officially sanctioned like writing collection with Bishop. I think the bishop's name's like Vigo or Vilgo or something. He's some Italian, but this young Catholic writer asked his bishop for permission to write a criticism of Vatican II, and through the official sanctions of the bishop, was able to publish within the Catholic Church a criticism of Vatican II. So it's not like you're going to get like kicked out and condemned for criticizing the church. Other churches might like expel you for criticizing their leaders. The Catholic Church allows you to find a sponsoring bishop and write an officially sanctioned criticism of itself. And they're usually pretty good. Like the book title of this guy, the title he chose for this is pretty inflammatory. It was a council of lies, and that's officially sanctioned by Catholic bishops. So like under the covers, the Catholic Church is very versatile and very broad in terms of like welcoming criticism, and a lot of times the criticism that leftists have are more eager to destroy the church than reform it. That's my thoughts about like a lot of the current controversies. I guess specifically with tradcasts, and I on Wednesdays I'll visit a Latin mass just for I like the literature a little bit, but I'm not going to make like a dogma. I am a fan of synodification of like vernacular approaches to worship. It seems kind of silly that God would decide, oh yeah, that one city in Europe, half the Mediterranean away, that's going to be my official and only sanctioned way of worshiping me after spending 2,000 years being worshipped in Hebrew, right? It's like kind of silly.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. That is the one. I don't like the Tradcats ecclesiology. I mean, I don't the whole sort of Francis is the Antichrist shtick. I have
yeah,
no sympathy with that. I have some sympathy for the I mean, I've attended Latin masses. I think they're gorgeous. I'm very grateful that I will be confirmed according to the old rite, as opposed to the Novus Ordo. But I'm not gonna like not go to the Novus Ordo, right? I mean,
yeah.
some Tradcats just they refuse to go to the Novus Ordo. I just find that ridiculous.
Yeah, I kind of find it like it's being very spiteful to your brother. The early church balance Greek style worship and Hebrew style worship and Egyptian style worship and Ethiopian style worship, and it managed to do that for centuries without any major problems. So I don't know why you can't, right? I'd also say there's something else I wanted to bring up. Yeah, so like I definitely have some thoughts about the role of the Pope. One of the interesting things you find when you study Greek and Latin is for example, the title Vicar of Christ. This is a controversial title in early Catholic thinking. It seems like you're not supposed to call yourself the Vicar of Christ, but it's okay for people to call you the Vicar of Christ. And the reason for that is a linguistic one. Let me try to hint you in the way that I'm going here, because it's always fun to lead people on with some hints.
Ooh, go on.
So what do you think Greece calls its vice president or vice minister in this case?
Oh god, I'm gonna come across like a complete nincompoop here. Um,
We can say what goes with your pasta.
sauce,
No, it's like
olive oil.
Antepasta, right? Antepasta
Ante-
it comes before right?
I'm English. I should have said chicken.
Yeah.
Really.
So what do you think the Greek vice president's title is in Greek?
Anti something.
Ante presidentos. Now,
Right. Okay.
now, if vice, is related to the word vicar, right? It's from the same etymology, vicar, vice, and things like it's like your second in command, right? If the Greek word for a vice minister is ante presidento, what do you think the title Vicar of Christ becomes in Greek?
And something like Antichristo.
Yes. So the title the title Vicar of Christ does accurately translate into Greek as Antichrist, but not in the negative sense.
Yeah.
So
I feel like I've been led into heresy here.
no. So the thing about calling yourself the Vicar of Christ is that you're saying you're second to Christ, and this is a very prideful thing to do. So it's traditionally in the older writing, like in the 300s to 400s, you see bishops saying, calling yourself the Antichristos is probably not good. But if we call you the Antichristos as like you are to us second to Christ, it's an honorific title. But if you call yourself second to Christ, it's an arrogant title. It's actually literally the Antichrist from the Bible. So this title in the papacy has always been controversial in early history when Greek and Latin were like known to each other better than in the Middle Ages.
I can only imagine how much this etymology has been seized upon by anti-Catholic Protestants.
Surprising. Well, you see, Greek wasn't known in the West during the Reformation, so no one wrote about it. I've done extensive research. No one in the West mentions, oh yeah, that guy we're calling the Antichrist is in Greek Antichrist, Vicar of Christ. The fact that not one Protestant leader knew this is another reason why I just now laugh at Protestantism as like a bit of a bumblefuck kind of way of doing Christianity. No offense, I shouldn't use that word.
I was just about to ask, bumblefuck. I've never heard that before, but
that's a term in America for a country bumpkin. So anyway, my concern with the Pope is like using the term correctly. A Pope should never call himself the Vicar of Christ. If he does so, he's essentially declaring himself an Antichrist. If other people call him an Antichrist in the sense of like being secondary to Christ in the world, I think that's okay. But if you're declaring yourself, I am second to Christ in all the world, it's a bit of an arrogant way of doing it. But many early Catholics didn't like the term Vicar of Christ for the same reason that in Greek it means Antichrist, for obvious reasons that the Bible doesn't like the Antichrist. So there are certain things that creep into the Latin-speaking West which have clear problems in the Greek-speaking East, just because of how the words translate. Anti in the ancient word didn't mean against; it meant alongside. And so essentially it's saying like, don't make yourself
Yeah,
a
like an antechamber.
yeah, exactly. Over time, especially with Protestants, it's become associated with, oh, you're anti, you're against, right? But that's really more of an English thing than a Greek thing. Um, you know, an ante Caesar or ante Basilios is merely the second in command of the Byzantine Empire when the emperor is away. An ante presidentos isn't against the president; he's merely the vice president. So there are these linguistic things that come in with the Pope that's worth bearing in mind, where there have been certain things that creeped in that maybe aren't appropriate to use, but they became honorific titles. Just my last thoughts about the Catholic Church, about like the role of the Pope. He's really meant to be who the bishops view as like second hand of Christ. The Pope should not view himself as second to Christ. He should probably view his bishops that advise him as like, or his confessor as one who is like an ante Christos to him, one who is alongside Christ with him, a confessor or a supporter. But those are some last thoughts. I think it's maybe good to. I don't know if you want to end on any other topic, but that's something to end on there.
Thank you. No, that was wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I think I've definitely taken up too much of your time at this point. So, I mean, I'd love to have you back on State of Disunion another time, because I want to discuss some of the things you wrote in your brilliant piece, "The Spaceman's Burden," but and also on hell. I'd love to talk about hell and the doctrine of hell. But those are all topics for another conversation. Clearly, we've got a lot of ammunition to be going on. So, this has been by far one of the most fascinating and enriching conversations I've ever had with anyone on YouTube. So I really thank you for coming on. Are there any last words or thoughts or plugs you want to mention?
Yeah, I'm writing a Substack right now about the 20-year anniversary of Battlestar Galactica. Because I think the themes of resurrection and what it means to be alive and if you deserve it are pretty relevant to today's politics. It's kind of a series written for a different time, but I don't know if you've linked my Substack in the video description, but
I
you know,
will
just
be. Yes, I will be adding that.
yeah, so I should get that done eventually. I want to eventually try to do a YouTube video on it, like one of those like retrospective videos that all the cool kids make. But that's pretty much all I can plug right now. I'm kind of taking it low on in real life. I'm a candidate for an architecture license and have to finish up my exams to be an officially sanctioned architect. But that's going to take most of my time up for the next couple of months.
Well, I'm sure that whatever buildings you design will be far better than the dross that we're currently treated to.
Yeah, hopefully, God willing. All right.
Well, God bless you, Ælþemplær. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time, and we'll leave it there until next time.
Yep. Bye bye.